but they wanted all.
Other way,
Other way.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is 2 o'clock, so I'd like to get this session underway. Welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. We're focusing on one item today, the Strategic Growth Plan. I'm very pleased to see all the officers, Cabinet Lead members and experts. In fact, I think what I'll do is I'll ask you to start with Tim Sachs and just introduce and say who you are, because there are some unfamiliar as well as familiar faces.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Tim Sachs. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of NHS East Leicestershire and Rutland Clinical Commissioning Group. I'm here today because I am the overall lead for general practice across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland as part of our future development planning.
Anne Crothers, Director of Environment and Transport.
Yes, Byron Rhodes, Deputy Leader of the Council and the Council's representative on the Members' Advisory Group which prepared this strategic plan.
Nicholas Rushton, Leader.
Tom Pennell, Assistant Chief Executive.
Pat Willoughby, Joint Strategic Planning Manager.
Grant Butterworth, Head of Planning at Leicester City Council.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just got some formalities to do. So the minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of January, are you all happy I sign those as a true and accurate record?
Yep.
Item 2 is question time. I have no questions, nor do I have any questions from members under Standing Order 7.3. Item 4, no urgent items to take this afternoon. Item 5, declarations of interest on the agenda. Now, I'm going to assume that all members who are also members of district councils, as planning authorities, which we are no doubt going to touch on, would wish to declare a non-prejudicial interest. Are you all happy with that?
Yes.
Okay, take that as read. Anybody got any other declarations? Right. Declarations of the party whip. Anybody being whipped this afternoon? No. Right. Presentation of petitions. I don't have any for this meeting. So that takes us to the item we're going to focus on. Now, can I just say before we start, the purpose of this session, I think, is to get evidence out, to get facts out, and then to have a discussion. So fine for people to give their views, what they think, ask questions. But what I'm really looking for is a comprehensive report at the end of this on evidence that we can send to the Cabinet and indeed the wider consultation process for this. So it's really about gathering facts, gathering evidence and trying to pin a number of things down which aren't at this stage completely clear. So how we're going to handle this, have you all got this additional sheet? I hope you have, headed Scrutiny Commission 7th of February Consideration Strategic Growth Plan. And you'll see there's a list of speakers which we're going to go through in that order, and they will make their various presentations or comments as they wish to. And then you'll see that we have, to focus the discussion by the members, we've broken down and we've taken key issues in the plan that need to be addressed, and they run over onto the other side. So that's how I want to try and run it. So, without further ado, Tom Pennell, Assistant Chief Executive, you're going to do an introduction, Tom.
Sorry, Chairman, I'd just say just a few words before Tom, because obviously Tom's going to talk about more detailed things. Can I say that we're kind of proud of this document? We'll be one of the few county and city areas in the whole country that have prepared it. I want to place on record my thanks to Byron, who's done the job on the MAG for myself, and also thanks on the record to all the district leaders who've tirelessly worked on it, and they've had to make some tough decisions and very difficult compromises. And also thank you to SPS and his team in the city for the work that they've inputted to it as well. In my view, if we can agree something like this, it will stand us in incredibly good stead. And in conversations with the Minister, this is the sort of thing they're looking for, and this is the sort of thing which will generate infrastructure going forward. And with that, Simon, I'll just hand over to Tom.
Thank you. What I plan to do in a fairly short introduction is say a few words about the plan, focusing on why it is important to the County Council. The paper in your pack summarises the process to date and key elements of the consultation draft strategic growth plan. I don't plan to dwell on that now, partly because some of that's in the pack already, and you'll be hearing later from others who will talk more about the plan itself and some of the implications of it for different issues. The plan has been the product of a lengthy process of collaborative working between the 9 local authorities and the LEP, supported in particular by Pat Willoughby, next to me here, in a jointly funded role, supporting the work, funded by all of the local authorities and the LEP. It's been a challenging and complex piece of work, and as the leader said, there are few areas in the country which can claim to have made this sort of progress on long-term strategic planning across their housing market area. And we do know that government has noticed this work, and civil servants have noticed this work and are aware of what's happening here. The Council has been a full and active member of the partnership producing this document. Mr Rhodes, as he mentioned, represents the Council on the Members' Advisory Group, and senior officers, including myself and Anne, are involved in the officer groups, and a number of other officers are actively working on the plan too. From a County Council perspective, the Commission and the Cabinet previously considered in 2016 the high-level strategic growth statement, which formed part 1 of the process. More recently, in November 2017, the Cabinet agreed the proposed consultation process on the plan, which is now underway, and all member briefings have been held on the plan and the HEDNA on 4 occasions within the Council, as set out in paragraph 16. The plan is important to the county councils for a number of reasons, and I've sort of got 5 here. Firstly, it provides a long-term framework for future development of the county and city, providing a single consistent framework for local plans across the area, and assisting in the planning of future infrastructure provision, including transport, and that will assist us to create sustainable new communities and protect key environmental assets. It also, importantly, provides a mechanism for Leicestershire communities, through their elected representatives, through yourselves, to shape and decide the long-term development of the area. If we don't produce a strategic growth plan, there are strong risks that future development would be unplanned and lack infrastructure, and that government, central government or developers would make the key decisions on our behalf. The plan supports the Council's aspirations as set out in the Council's recently agreed strategic plan to improve economic and housing outcomes across the county. And also the plan, assuming that it will at some point be approved, sends a strong message to government that partners in this area can take difficult decisions about future growth and plan effectively for it. And that will help us secure funding from government to deliver essential infrastructure to support the plan. And finally, the Council is subject to the duty to cooperate, and this work assists the Council and its partners to discharge this duty to the satisfaction of the government and local plan inspectors. So there's a number of reasons why this is an important piece of work to the County Council as well as to the wider area. Just an observation about the plan here. It's important, I think, to note that the figures in the plan, and there's always likely to be a focus on the numbers, and they are important, but the figures in the plan aren't set in stone, particularly for the period beyond 2031, but for the period ahead of that too. New evidence will come forward, and this will inevitably lead to changes to the current forecasts that underpin the plan, and we will need to adjust our planning accordingly. We can't know now whether we will need to provide exactly 186,000 dwellings, or whatever the figure is, by 2050. The amount needed might be more or less, and I think we all know the sorts of things that might happen in the future that will impact on that. But I think we can say with some confidence that we will need that many homes at some point in the foreseeable future. It may be by 2045 rather than 2050, it may be by 2055. The key thing is that by planning for the long term on the basis of the evidence that we currently have available, we can put a strategy in place that enables future housing requirements to be met in ways which support the economy, protect environmental assets, and create communities that are well served by infrastructure. So I think it's the strategy rather than the numbers that's perhaps critical. Not saying that the numbers aren't important. The Cabinet will be considering how it responds to the draft plan at its meeting in March, and in doing that will take account of the views of the Commission today, and the presentations which will follow shortly on the plan itself, on the transport and health dimensions of it, and on development capacity in Leicester, will, I hope, provide valuable information to inform your discussion.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Right, so Nick, you've done your bit. You were next, but you've done your initial.
To be fair, I was only talking about strategic stuff. Byron did all the work on it.
Yeah,
so,
I've got Byron down.
Okay.
Yeah, to summarise, I'm sure there'll be some questions for you, Nick, at a later point. Right, so now going to move to Pat Willoughby, Strategic Joint Planning Manager. Pat's going to give us a PowerPoint presentation. So, please.
Thank you, Chair. As part of this presentation, I was asked to address specifically 2 or 3 matters, so I'm planning to start with those because they provide some context to the plan, and then I'll move on to discuss the approach that we've taken to preparing the plan itself. So the first thing that I was asked to consider was the relationship between the Housing and Economic Development Needs Assessment and the Strategic Growth Plan. What this first slide does is it explains very simply, it's a complicated process, but what this does is explain very simply what a Housing and Economic Development Needs Assessment is and how it's prepared. The fundamental requirement is that it should set out the objectively assessed need for market and affordable housing. And the guidelines for preparing a document like that are set out in the National Planning Policy Framework and in additional planning guidelines. So there is an agreed methodology for preparing documents like this. There are 3 main elements to undertaking a study like this. The first is that you look at the demographic need for new housing. So that's all about analysing population and household growth. The second thing you take into consideration is whether those figures have to be adjusted upwards to take account of particular pressures for economic growth. And the third thing you have to do is to look at what additional requirements you might wish to provide in order to take account of pressures for affordable housing. In their conclusions, the requirement is to set out the overall level of housing need at the level of what's called the housing market area, but also at the level of individual authorities. Interestingly, in Leicester and Leicestershire, the housing market area is just the city and the county. Quite unusual in that respect. Many authorities have housing market areas that extend into other places, but in Leicester and Leicestershire it's really quite tightly defined. Moving on then to what the Housing and Economic Development Needs Assessment says for Leicester and Leicestershire, and in this presentation I'll just focus on the total figures across the bottom. The 2 sets of columns on this slide are contained within the Strategic Growth Plan, and what this demonstrates is that in the period up to 2031 there's a total requirement of around 96,580 dwellings, and that in the period up to 2036 we'll need something like another 20,000. So in total a need for 118,000 dwellings in the period up to 2036. The next slide in the sequence is one that shows the way in which those numbers are made up. On this slide it shows the number per annum as opposed to the total numbers. But what this shows on the slide is that in orange you have the level of need that's created by demographic change. So that's increases in population, migration, births and deaths, and that takes up the very large proportion of the actual need. The second thing which this slide shows in pale blue is an amount of housing, relatively modest amount, which takes account of longer-term migration requirements. And finally, in purple, it shows, again, relatively smaller amounts that would be needed in terms of improving affordability. Now, that's not to say that affordability is a relatively minor consideration in this process as a whole, but it recognises that the vast majority of the need in Leicester and Leicestershire is driven by changes in population dynamics. Moving on to the next slide, a similar set of measures here. this looks at the housing need in terms of the local authority level, and it shows the very substantial variation between the different authorities in Leicester and Leicestershire. And in terms of indicating where that need comes from, once again in orange it shows the scale of demographic need, which has been considered looking at a longer-term trends in terms of migration. It then identifies an amount of growth which would be needed in order to deal with some affordability requirements, and then finally it shows relatively small amounts of growth that would be needed to support economic growth, and that applies only in the case of Melton and North West Leicestershire. Throughout the rest of the city and the county, the scale of economic growth that's anticipated can be accommodated by the population that's driven naturally within the constituent areas. So the purpose of these slides was to give you some idea of the scale of growth that has been indicated by the HEDNA and the ways in which those figures are made up. One of the points to make about the HEDNA is that has been produced using reliable government statistics. They do change over time, and there is a requirement on all local authorities to keep them under review and up to date. But we have used conventional, reliable government statistics to produce this study. Looking at the next slide, the other thing that the HEDNA did as part of its work was to identify the amount of new employment land that would need to be provided in Leicester and Leicestershire. Once again, we look at the two periods, 20 up to 31 and then up to 36. And in this case, we identify the amount of land that's needed for essentially the three principal categories. So that's offices and light industry, secondly manufacturing processes, and then thirdly small warehousing and distribution activity. I should point out that there's an additional requirement for strategic distribution activity. All of this work was informed by economic forecasting undertaken by consultants working on our behalf, working from a national, regional down to a local level. The statistics were moderated with reference to local economic conditions, and also the authorities had commissioned their own study of the logistics and distribution industry, so that study has been influential in shaping these numbers. Going on to the next slide, this is the point at which we say we have a HEDNA which is using very robust statistics, up-to-date statistics, to a point where we say we want to look at longer-term growth. Now, when you start to look at longer-term growth, there are no reliable, if I can choose my words carefully, there are reliable authoritative statistics that you can use up to 2050. So what we have done is we've extrapolated the figures that we have within the HEDNA. They are the most reliable and reasonable process for us to take, because there is no other substitute that we could use. The purpose of this work, however, was to give us some kind of order of magnitude scale of growth that we might anticipate over this 20-year period. And in broad terms, what this analysis has suggested is that for the 20 years after 2031, the scale of growth is broadly similar to that which we've experienced in the period up to 31, but there is a moderate lessening of the growth over that period of time. Now, in this strategy here, and this diagram here, what we've looked at in the two left-hand columns are the number of dwellings that would have to be provided per annum, and then the total number of dwellings, which is 90,500 or so during the period 2031 to 50. In the sets of columns to the right of that, what we do is we look at the amount of development that we think could be accommodated on non-strategic sites. So that's very small sites up to maybe sites of 200-300 dwellings or thereabouts. And we also estimate how much development we think could or should be directed towards strategic sites. So that's more akin to the strategic urban extensions, which you're familiar with, garden settlements, garden villages, major expansions of the existing urban area. And in this diagram, what we're proposing through the strategic growth plan is that rather than continue a trend which has taken place to date of the majority of development taking place on non-strategic sites, so that's relatively modest sites spread across the whole of Leicester and Leicestershire in different ways. What we're proposing here is that you should shift that focus so that more development comes forward on strategic sites. Bringing them forward in strategic sites gives you the opportunity to align infrastructure and services, and to ensure that the growth is planned in accordance with services availability. And having done that, it gives us the information that we need to use with government and other agencies to lobby for that infrastructure and to help them to plan for that infrastructure as it's needed. One of the reasons why we've chosen to work out to the period 2050 is that although local plans generally only look something like 15 years ahead, other agencies are often planning to much longer time frames. So Network Rail, for example, is already planning to 2046. And if we want to influence their strategic growth plans, we need to be able to give them evidence of how we aspire to grow and develop the rail network in Leicester and Leicestershire. And other agencies work on a similar basis. So, as I say, this is what we call the notional need and supply in Leicester and Leicestershire over the period of the strategic growth plan. I think the final thing that comment to make about numbers is that we've also looked in great detail at the scale of provision already in the pipeline up to 2031, and we're very confident indeed that looking at development that is already built, has planning permission, is allocated in adopted local plans, we can meet the total requirements up to 2031. And that's why this plan, in terms of a new spatial distribution, focuses on the period beyond 31. Turning now to how the plan has evolved, what we've tried to do is to prepare this plan, recognising that the world doesn't stop. There are always things that you have to pick up on, some of which might be useful to you, some of which you might already have influenced. So one of the starting points that we had for our work was the idea that we wanted to root any new strategy in the current settlement pattern of Leicester and Leicestershire. And that already throws up a pattern of a very strong central city, obviously Leicester, with a series of market towns, each independent, characterful, with its own economic rationale, its own problems, its own opportunities, but a ring of market towns linked to Leicester by a series of radial routes. Two really strong rural areas, rural communities to the west and to the east of the M1, different in character but all very valuable in their own right. And we wanted to reflect that in the shape of the strategy that we evolved. The second influence on the plan were national policies. We have to, as planners, we have to work within that framework, and that requirement extends to economic growth and transport matters as well. But the two that I flagged up here are the industrial strategy and the housing strategy. The industrial strategy is obviously a very important part of government's agenda. The local economic partnership is preparing its own industrial strategy, and what we've done in our plan is to take the messages from those emerging documents and through work with the LEP to try and support what we want to support in Leicester and Leicestershire and try to make that a positive activity. In terms of the housing strategy, this is the government's agenda to deal with problems in the housing market, but it's about delivering homes at a faster rate and, importantly, making sure that infrastructure is provided in line with the need. Importantly, also, government is encouraging all local authorities across the country to develop new ways of undertaking strategic planning. They're developing quite specific guidelines at the moment. There's the consultation document at present, but government is also quite keen to ensure that strategic planning takes place properly to the point where they're willing now to intervene in local authorities that are not doing their strategic planning properly. And that's why taking the lead as we're doing in initiating our own plan puts us in very good stead with government on that matter. Turning just very quickly and wrapping up this conversation, the next thing we did was to look at the Midlands Engine strategy. This is we say that we take our lead from this, but the reality is that the information contained in that document has gone into it very largely at the request of ourselves in various guises. And there's a long list of activities in here which I think individually each of the authorities would want to support for a variety of reasons, and that's one of the reasons why we've taken it as one of the building blocks for our plan. Similar situation exists in respect of the Midlands Connect strategy. It is a document, again, like the Midlands Engine strategy, it's a document which has a degree of government support, and the short list of projects identified here have come from a very long list of projects which were put into discussion with Midlands Connect, and these are the ones that we ourselves have supported as priorities. And again, having gone into the Midlands Connect strategy, the growth plan picks up on these and says let's follow through on those. The next plan here is one of our environmental assets, environmental constraints. This plan doesn't reproduce well as a PowerPoint slide, but there is a vast amount of GIS information that we've been using as we've been preparing the strategic growth plan. Finally then, that takes me on to the strategy diagram itself, and what this does is it reflects the consensus of the local planning authorities and the LEP and tries to bring forward a strategy which concentrates development into strategic locations. So that's why we have a significant concentration around Leicester and the proposed new bypass around the southern and eastern sides of Leicester. It also reflects the strong emphasis for growth around the northern and southern edges of the county, and that's why we propose 2 growth areas there. Both of those are influenced by the fact that there's strong economic activity just outside of our area as well. And within some, we have highlighted 2 growth areas, Melton Mowbray and Lutterworth, on the basis that both of those are currently proposed for growth within emerging local plans. And then finally, the settlements with the dotted lines. Those are places which have already taken a substantial amount of growth to date. Some of that still has to be built out, and there's a sense that in those areas we'd like to see growth catching up and further provision being made through the local plans. Elsewhere, we would try to limit the growth to satisfy local needs only. And that's really how the plan has evolved and been shaped, and some of the considerations that we've applied when coming to those conclusions for the draft plan.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. The next presentation is from Anne Carruthers. She's going to focus on the transport aspects of the plan.
Good afternoon, all. I'll just start by telling you where those photographs are. It might put you in some context as well. That's work. These were taken in January, and it's work that's been carried out on Junction 13 at the A42 and A511 up in the northwest of the county. Just sort of put those in as a wee bit of context there. Some up-to-date infrastructure improvements that are happening. I just wanted to set a wee bit of context first, if I can, just to remind about what we're trying to achieve with transport. I know we're focusing on growth today. However, in the overall transport world, what we're trying to do is make sure we have got an accessible, connected county that supports business and growth, quality of life, etc. So that's about enabling reliable journeys on the network, and obviously there's a whole host of activities that are involved under that, everything from filling in potholes to supporting accessibility. However, what we are focusing in today is very much on that enabling growth and enabling that continued vitality and prosperity. And again, there's a number of factors that sit underneath that. In terms of the strategic growth plan, and obviously we're looking out to 2050, and we all know that's a long way away, what we've been doing to get the transport information to understand what we'd need in order to facilitate that view of the strategic growth plan that Pat's just outlined for you, we very much to the early 2030s look to the local plan work. As we know, the local plans set out the growth that we would anticipate coming along to that date, and actually ourselves in the city for their similar local plan have done the work to understand the transport infrastructure that would be required to support that growth. So we're fairly confident that we can actually facilitate that growth in terms of transport requirements for the current local plans. So that very much, that work is slotting in here to give us that confidence and robustness around the growth in the earlier part of the strategic growth plan. We have worked with the district councils in supporting each of their local plans. They have been tested, as you know, through examination in public, etc., in terms of robustness. Now, one aspect of that is the transport. We also have carried out various supplementary studies to that, because either we feel there's issues in an area we particularly want to tackle or address, and there's a number of other transport studies that supplement that. I need to, just remember to move on, but not too far. Let's get the right one. We're not there. We've done that one there. I've just done a summary of that one. And just to give you, a bit of an overview of the types of things, some of you will be very familiar with some of these, but hopefully you've all got an awareness. Most of them are set out in the Prospectus for Growth, which, we issued last September, etc. So hopefully none of these are new to you. Just give you a really quick flavour. As I say, this is looking to 2030, period 2031, Colville Transport Strategy. 10,400 houses. We're looking at key junctions on the E511 corridor in order to bring that forward and support that. And those photographs on the first slide was very much about one of the key early priorities, junction 13 and the A42. We've already improved junction 22, the M1, the other end of the corridor. And we're now looking at development work, for instance, for the Flying Horse roundabout, the next one on that. There is an ongoing plan there and able to bring that to support and allow that development to come forward. Castle Donington. This is a bit more of a smaller scale, and again, I think it's a good example in terms of actually the detail comes out often when you get to the planning application stage. This is 900 dwellings, this actually Relief Road to Castle Donington, which facilitates the growth but brings considerable benefits to that community through the centre of the community in terms of less congestion, less traffic. Hinckley, you should all hopefully be familiar with that. We've been doing lots of work on that for a number of years, and that's ongoing. We're getting to the latter stages, but there's still more to do. And that's about ensuring the significant development that's going on around the town actually is well connected into the town. So we're addressing both the congestion at the junctions, but we're also providing connectivity, be that by public transport, be that by walking, be that cycling, into Hinckley Town Centre from the new growth areas. And that, as I say, is an ongoing piece of work. Desford Crossroads, again, this is about tying in growth areas, making them work in terms of, the demand for travel and where people from those areas will want to be travelling. This junction was seen as a key constraint to that. Has been identified that it needs investment in terms of capacity, and hence, therefore, it would be on our list in order to support that growth going forward. Anstey Lane, the E46, this is one we're doing in collaboration with the City Council, and we'll see improvements at the E46 junction just on the edge of Leicester and in the main corridor coming into Leicester that supports directly the housing at Ashton Green on that northwest aspect of our area of Leicester. Loughborough, I'm on the right side. No, I've jumped ahead. Loughborough, again, many of you will be aware, significant growth in Loughborough, particularly the Gallander growth area. This scheme sees improvements at junction 23 and along the E512 corridor, includes walking, cycling, etc., in order to help facilitate that and ensure Loughborough can continue to function and enable that growth. and obviously significantly will directly impact on the university, etc., and the growth that's happening there. Market Harborough, we have carried out a transport study there and again identified the measures that we feel would be needed in order to accommodate the growth that is planned for Market Harborough. And again, that's something we brought recently to Scrutiny and then Cabinet. Melton, another one I'm pretty sure you'll all be familiar with. The wider transport strategy in the short term looks at easing congestion in the town centre and seeing a number of small-scale improvements. But I'm sure, as you're all aware, the kind of medium-term infrastructure that's required to support the growth across Melton is a Melton Distributor Road, and we're currently in a process of bidding for funding from government in order to secure that and be able to deliver that. M1 Junction 20A. Again, just remind you of those objectives up front. One was about enabling, one's about enabling growth, but the other is about the existing network, etc., and addressing issues there. This one does both, because primarily we have significant issues at Junction 21, which I'm sure a number of you will be well aware of. Part of this, Junction 20A, would help ease that, as well as ease some issues at Junction 19. However, it also has the potential to support growth, and particularly just off that in terms of both housing and employment. Moving on, however, that's the kind of localised infrastructure we would we have identified that's needed to support those local plans. We all know that we're not the only players in terms of transport. Actually, there's things that are happening at the regional and the national levels. It gives us a whole host of opportunities in terms of taking advantage of what those other organisations involved in very much providing for transport or facilitating transport, taking advantage of what they're already doing or planning, and also taking the opportunity to influence to make sure that we're achieving what we want for the county and the city. Key there, as you've already heard, Pat's mentioned Midlands Connect and their strategy and what they've outlined in that. Highways England and Network Rail. Again, big players in our area. We have got a considerable amount of strategic road network, i.e. the motorway network, and it's integral, as you know, to the functioning of the county. And again, Network Rail, very important. Rail growth, as I'm sure you're all aware, is growing and growing and growing, and it's something we need to be influencing to ensure we get the improvements we want for the county and the city. Just coming on to some of those then. And again, some of these will be kind of medium term. Nothing's ever short term when you get this big, but kind of medium term and longer term. You're very aware of the A46 Expressway. Now, there's two things that kind of, in my mind, kind of collaborated here to get us to where we are at the moment. Firstly, Midlands Connect, in doing their work around their strategy, identified a number of issues, a key one for the region being east-west connectivity. I think we all know it's quite easy it depends on whether you hit traffic jam or an accident, but it is easier to do the north-south movements. The east-west movements are just not quite so conducive to ease of movement and reliability of journey, and tend to be a bit more around the houses. That was identified as a key issue for Midlands Connect, road and rail. And one of the solutions to that has been identified as the A46 corridor there. Sorry, you won't see the detail of that, I'm sure, but actually the map there on the left-hand side takes you from Exeter up to Hull. Because literally that's where the E46 or original route of the A46 ran. If you look, the middle one is a bit more localised in terms of south of Birmingham up to Newark. Now, that's the bit we're particularly interested in terms of, or Midlands Connect see major benefits from, because in improving that corridor to the expressway, what you're doing is you're potentially giving significant benefits, and by benefits I mean relief, to the M5, M42, M6 all around Birmingham. So actually you're improving east-west connectivity and you're giving a bit more resilience for those strategic movements. What you do in going round Leicester, however, the diagram on the right, actually to the south and to the east of Leicester, in not only giving that reliability, because actually the reality about the M1 is while they're doing smart, or there's an intention to do smart motorway, that at most gives you 10-15 years capacity. We're looking to 2050. Beyond that, Highways England at the moment do not have any plans or ideas about how they will deal with those capacity issues come, the end of their 10-15 year period. Therefore, to the south and the east of Leicester gives you that resilience again, gives you that other opportunity, and gives you that relief potentially for the M1 corridor. Now, the other aspect to that is obviously at the same time when we're looking at, and as Pat's outlined for you already, how are we going to facilitate this growth that very much is on the national agenda and we're being required to facilitate across the county and the city? Actually, it gives us an opportunity to deliver growth there. So it's two things merging there. There's regional and national benefits from this route, but for Leicestershire and Leicester, actually there's the opportunity to open up land for development. Oh, sorry, are you still on that, David?
No, it's the first time I've seen this lot. It's rather
some of those diagrams are in the prospectus for growth, which was, issued last September.
Yeah, we'll ensure that members receive all the slides from this afternoon. No, after the meeting, we'll email them round. A5 improvements, again, you're all very aware about the A5 corridors and some of its shortcomings. An expressway approach to that, again, would see significant benefits in terms of that east-west growth. As we all know, that corridor is particularly important to employment. There's lots of opportunities along there. There's existing businesses as well, but there's a lot of issues in the existing corridor at the moment. The A42, again, still on that east-west connectivity, particularly down to Birmingham, up to Nottingham and beyond. And we know, it goes from motorway to A-class road, and it's about getting that consistency and getting the level of service really we'd want to see from a corridor like that and the benefits it would bring. Coming on to rail, there's a number of rail east-west initiatives. I've just put one up here, which is Linuckle, which is probably, in terms of the city and the county, the top priority for us at the moment, and that's about direct connectivity between Leicester and Coventry. At the moment, you can't do that journey directly, and in terms of the journey time, it just really isn't viable or competitive with the car. However, as we all know, significant growth area and corridor, and it's about improving accessibility as well as the connectivity. Sorry, just to wrap up there, and the strategic transport plan work that we're carrying out with the city, not only support, it's got a wider function, however, it is there to support the strategic growth plan. Basically, what we're doing with that is bringing together that work that's already been done to support the existing local plans. We've got that, it's been tested, we know what's needed to 2030 in order to deliver growth. We are then using the opportunity of what's happening in other areas, i.e. Midlands Connect, what they've identified as a key priorities for their area. Part of the reality is when it comes to funding and delivery, the more join-up we have, the more chance we have of success. And what we're doing is we're looking particularly at carrying out the modelling work, which is what's going on at the moment, in order to really understand the implications for the whole of Leicester and Leicestershire to that 2050 period. That modelling work should be available in the early March. For information, for obviously augmenting what you've already got. However, we're very much anticipating, as I say, to 2030, we know what's already needed. What we'll be able to do is identify where things are covered and where actually we've got further work to do in terms of the stresses in the network. What would emphasise, however, is this will be an ongoing iterative process. I mean, if you think about it at the moment, for the existing local plans, we actually, in areas that have been allocated for housing growth, we don't at the moment know every detail of the transport infrastructure that will be required to facilitate that, be it 100 houses or be it 500 houses, etc. That will come through time
in terms of further transport study work, the transport assessment for planning applications, and then all the details of things like cycling access, walking access, public transport accessibility, exactly what a junction will look like, etc., will come out of that work. So the thing I would stress to you is actually we're very much an iterative process on this. What we aim to do is to identify the key strategic things so we're not missing the real opportunities with the likes of Highways England to get it in their future programmes and IE funding, same with Network Rail, same with Midlands Connect, because actually the way things are going they could have a powerful voice with government in terms of securing some of that funding as well. So it's about understanding the big ticket items, and over time we will flush out and work out actually the smaller scale infrastructure, the public transport connectivity, exactly how that will look, the sustainable, the active travel options that will come along with that to augment and provide the bigger picture. And as I said, just the last point there, in terms of funding, very much about, actually the same as at present and how we fund infrastructure. It's bids to government through whatever funding stream, housing infrastructure fund, local growth fund, etc. It'll be the development sector, and actually it's those other organisations such as Network Rail and Highways England. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Right, we've got Tim Sachs next, who's going to talk to us about the health implications of
thank you, Chair.
This growth.
Thank you, Chair. I do appreciate it. Now, I have to say, I was only invited last week and only managed to read this plan for the first time today. I wasn't aware of the plan's existence. However, I have read it at great length today and just wanted to really say that it's a real welcome from the health perspective to see this level of planning to enable us to look at what we're going to do with growth. This level of information, which enables us to be able to plan both for primary care and also for acute and community beds, is incredibly important. Realistically, good planning will really help us in the long run. If we just take the example of Lubbersthorpe, where back in 2008, the knowledge of that number of houses has meant that there is money set aside for a brand new health centre which will cover up to 12,000 people. It's that sort of example of what's happened in the past which will be absolutely crucial to any development of this nature. Just some context with looking at primary healthcare particularly, we already have a significant number of practices in Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland which really aren't necessarily big enough or as fit for purpose as we'd like in the current environment. Growth quite often gets absorbed. With planning of this magnitude, that just won't be the case. There will need to be, looking at this number of homes, we could be looking at anywhere between 10 and 20 new large health centres across the area, dependent on the density of the population. Part of our issue with health, when it comes to primary care particularly, is the long-term planning. When we review our premises, we know for a fact that across the 139 separate practices in our area, there are probably about a third of those who could do with either expanding or replacing. Knowing where they sit in comparison to this might give us an opportunity to be able to do something much bigger, and having that opportunity to long-term plan will be incredibly helpful. One of the biggest issues that I see in the long run with this is, as people are aware, staffing of healthcare staff is a major problem. GPs, nurses, other health professionals. With long-term planning and knowledge of the funding that will come through, I'm assuming through Section 106 for the building of these, plus the planning for staffing, will enable there to be the appropriate growth that's necessary. And we will be able to then build these plans into the existing plans that we have. But I'll be really honest, our plans for health in primary care really only go as far as around 5 years at the moment. And the knowledge of this actually helps us to look exactly where we are. In fact, actually, I only discovered there was a plan for a new garden village in Melton a month or so ago when talking to the chief exec of the district council. Now, it's that sort of connection and information which will then help us in the long run to be able to support that. When it comes to acute and community beds, some members here will be aware of the Sustainability and Transformation Partnership and the plan. The latest version of that has not yet been released, but what it is doing is looking far more to the future of beds that are going to be necessary in 10 or 15 years than the current need. But actually, with the number of the number of people who will be population that will be increasing in Leicestershire, may require something slightly bigger than the existing hospital infrastructure that we have currently. 116,000 homes could bring in the best part of 250,000 people, so that will require quite significant planning in the long run. And as I said, being the first time I've seen this, I'm not sure who else of my colleagues have been involved, but I think it's very important that the example of today is how we can work far more closely together for this longer term planning. And I'm afraid I haven't got that much more to say, but we'll obviously be happy to take any questions in the future.
I think that's really helpful, particularly that you're involved at this point. That's the main thing, isn't it, to have you on board and, as you say, to be having discussions for planning purposes. That's the difference I think you can make. Right, I'm going to move now to Grant Butterworth, Head of Planning from Leicester City Council. Why are they here? Well, because it's a plan for Leicester and Leicestershire, that's the first point. But secondly, because a key element is the need for the districts to accommodate what the city is not going to be able to accommodate. And I think that's the issue we're particularly interested in hearing from you. Why can't you consume your own smoke?
We'll do our best, Chair. I'm very happy to be here, and again, there's an awful lot of information in these slides. I'm conscious that you probably want to get onto the questions, so I will rattle through them and pick up any questions. You've already seen, I think, these figures in Pat's presentation. This is the objectively assessed need and the possibly theoretical total capacity of the city. When we saw these figures coming from the HEDNA, we knew and we had to announce that we didn't conceive we could be able to meet our requirements of 34,000 to 2031 or 42,000 almost to 2036, when really all the possible identified sites in the system at the moment in the city, if everything was built out, would only give you 26,000. So that's the really bad news. However, the better news is that we are committed through our local plan to actually go as far as we can to meet those needs as best we can. So our new local plan will include a new evidence-based target, and it will include a whole range of viable land allocations that we will allocate to show how we can meet our needs as best we can to 2031. And the City Mayor's made it very clear that he wants us to seriously consider all land for development and exhaust all options. I think, but the other thing to bear in mind is it isn't just about housing within the city. We do need to make sure that we consider the need and the important need for employment needs, obviously jobs, look at appropriate open space provision, transport provision, a whole range of other issues which I'll pick up on as I go through the presentation. So we completed our first stage consultation just at the year end. We're planning to produce a draft local plan which will set out those allocations this summer with the intention of having that plan examined and a plan adopted towards the end of next year. So at the moment, at present, we really welcome the strategic growth plan discussions, and the timetable fits well. Although we do appreciate that we need to be able to sort of categorically assert how far we can go in meeting our needs in order to be able to be reflected in not just strategic growth plan, but also the local plans that will follow. So in terms of what the HEDNA means for us, or the strategic growth plan means for us, we're almost now at 1,700 homes per year required to 2031, and a similar level to 2036. Now that's a significant increase on the expectations that were set out in the last housing market assessment, which was 1,350 houses per annum, which again was an increase on the previous core strategy target, which was just less than 1,300 houses per annum. When you look at what we've been delivering, the top line, dark line, is the new HEDNA target, 1,700. You can see the second line, straight line, is the 2014 core strategy requirement, and the curvy line is actually what's been delivered. And actually that is not bad going. We've been consistently in the top 10 authorities across the country in terms of housing delivery, but I think you can see we've rarely got near to the core strategy requirement. So the and that's with actually trying very hard. We've actually allocated lots of very controversial sites in our previous local plans, things like allotments, playing fields, farmland, Ashton Green. The City Council made difficult decisions in the past, and those sites are actually, most of them are actually being built out at the moment. St Mary's allotments, Blackbird Own playing fields, Franklin Fields, they've all been subject to very, very heated debates at the Planning Committee over the last 12 months, and 2 of those 3 are on site now. So the good news is the City is delivering. And we've also been trying to make sure that we really maximise the potential for development in the regeneration areas on brownfield land in the city centre through a whole range of investments in the city, which I won't go into in great detail. But in terms of what that potentially adds up to, so coming back to what might be realistic, so we've already got some completions achieved. We've got some sites under construction. We've got some sites with planning permission, outline planning permission, allocations in our Save Local plan, and again an estimate of effectively 150 a year in terms of windfall sites. That gives you almost 22,000, which actually is, as I've highlighted early on, well short of the requirement that we're expected to meet. In terms of where we might be able to meet it, that plan doesn't read very well, but much of our land is very constrained. The city, there's green wedges come into the city. Much of the green space within the city is either highly valued, could be constrained by heritage assets, heritage designations or biodiversity, or actually quite a substantial exposure to flooding. So again, the limited opportunities that we need to look at are actually quite difficult for us to consider. So the local plan puts everything out on the table. The consultation just concluded, 270 sites, actually a significant proportion which are owned by the city. And we asked people which ones of these do we feel are capable of being developed. We have seen good city centre delivering in significant years, but this isn't a limitless opportunity that will carry on forever, but we're doing detailed urban capacity work in the city centre. And we're looking at things like policy choices in terms of things like space standards, internal space standards for residential development, to see how far can we realistically expect the city centre to go in terms of tall buildings, density and other constraints. Beyond 2031, the picture becomes very difficult. We feel that we're projecting a limited amount of land left potentially at the house at Ashton Green, and we're working on the assumption that really up until 31 we'll really develop the last remaining substantial opportunities, and beyond 2031 further loss of open space, recreational sports land, we don't think is going to be likely to be acceptable. Most of the regeneration sites are likely to be completed. That's the water side on there. We're actually actively developing 3 or 4 sites in there. We just secured a CPO. And again, the only other potential supply is really windfalls and intensification, which I've mentioned before. So that picture to 2050 is more difficult, and that's why I think we do need to plan together with the county and the districts. And that's why the strategic growth plan, I think, is essential for all of us. Our estimate of what can be provided per year at post-2031 is about 550 dwellings per annum. And again, I think a point I'd stress, it's in everybody's interest to make sure that actually the city adopts an achievable target in its local plan. Because if we under-deliver on our target in the local plan, the government's new requirement will be that we'd have to add an additional 20% to plan for, and that effectively would just make the problem worse, that we'd be coming to the districts to ask for help in providing an additional 20%. So I think it's in all of our interest to make sure that our plan is robust and really pushes the boundary, but it's as deliverable as we can deliver against it, because if we don't, we'll come to regret it. Student housing was a very substantial component of our supply. It was about 45% of those numbers in recent years that I showed you on the graph. That's actually now around 30%. Student growth has slowed down, and there are again issues about to what extent is other universities going to grow. And again, we need to look at the employment picture. Our employment land shortage has been known for some years. The plans that we agreed with Labour, Charnwood and Core Strategy that much of our industrial expansion would be delivered in those districts, I'm afraid hasn't been delivered by the market. Charnwood's provision has actually slipped, and most of the take-up in Blaby has actually been in distribution. So we need to deal with the pressures. The industrial vacancy rate in the city has actually gone down from 10% to up to 3%. 3% is considered in industry terms to be a really a very, very not an acceptable position in terms of vacancy. Employment and residential land values are comparable, which is very unusual, and Leicester employers are really reporting huge difficulties to us in terms of how they may expand, and we've got a substantial demand that we need to be able to meet as well as the housing demand. That shows the assessment of the employment areas, which I won't dwell on. But also in terms of employment, it's not just about employment, it's also about the city centre and the city centre office development. And actually looking at how do we sustain our textile and our help deliver the LEP's priorities of sector-based growth, which again is in everybody's interest in terms of maintaining the city's economic performance at the centre of the city. We want to protect as much open space as we can. We have a target in our core strategy which is actually relatively low compared to other cities. There'll be big pressure from stakeholders, environmental stakeholders, to retain that target. But if any allocations on green space and the increased population will make that almost impossible. And again, there are significant public health issues related to air quality, the use of parks, and again, the nature of the pressures on the city, which we do need to take into account in terms of making sure that the city remains livable and attractive in terms of it as a place to live. So this plan shows all the sites that we put out to consultation. Though many of those sites, as I mentioned before, have constraints such as flooding, heritage, and biodiversity. So when you take those sites out of the picture, it leaves you with those to choose from. So we're currently looking at all those sites in a great amount of detail and to look at whether they are suitable for development, and we're considering the consultation responses of the emerging options consultation just concluded. We also need to consider infrastructure to support that big population growth. In terms of schools, we have a massive pressure. 3 new secondary schools are required in the next 2.5 years. Those are going to be big sites, big schools, big buildings on big sites. That's going to put pressure on allocations. And we also need to look at the sports and play demands of those future schools. And we also need to look at traffic and transport quality impacts, which again, as Anna's mentioned, we're working together with the county in terms of looking at how we can manage the infrastructure impacts of the growth, and the wider infrastructure will actually relieve city pressures. So in conclusion, we've been delivering on average about 1,000 houses a year. We don't think we can sustain that going forward. We'll go as far as we can, but if you play in the viability and deliverability challenge, then we won't be able to meet our whole objectively assessed need. That 25,000 of potential supply to 2031, that's at best. It assumes, as I said earlier on, almost all of the Shlar sites that we know about being developed out. When we think, and this is a guidance, we think our potential shortfall is somewhere between 11,000 13,000 to 2031. And again, we think that the notional guide figure that we're working to is potentially for an additional allocations to allow for 3,000 additional houses on top of the allocations that we'll be rolling forward from the current plan. So that's all the existing allocations and the expectations from the city. So effectively what that would do would really mean that to 2031 we'd be delivering delivering about 2/3 of our requirement and expecting the adjoining districts to deliver with that the remaining third. Beyond 2031 going forward, the 550 a year, that really, I guess that implies we'll be delivering about 1/3 of our housing need, and effectively 2/3 of that growth would have to be delivered outside the city. But I guess I'd conclude by saying that I think that the difficult decisions that we're taking now, that we're all taking now, will actually set future local plan reviews in very, very good shape. If you have this strategic plan adopted with infrastructure, with a good chance of securing the infrastructure to support that growth, that means that the next local plan reviews, not just the ones that districts are actually working on at the moment, will actually prove to be hopefully a much more measured, sensible and strategic process than the last round. With that, Chair, I'll leave it. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive assessment of the situation in the city. I think it's very important to understand that. Right. Byron, you've waited patiently, listened to all the presentations. You are the County Council's representative on the MAG.
I am.
Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Just feels a little bit like the ponies and the dog show. You've had the ponies, now you've got the dog. So I'll do my best without having the professionalism of the previous speakers, who I think have done extremely well. And the last presentation has shown that how little opportunity there is for significant more growth of the city, which is not surprising. However, growth is coming, and it can't be held back. We're all living longer. I personally intend to live forever, but most of us intend to live into old age if we can. On top of that, there are more people wanting to come and live in the county. And if we are to be in control of the future, or attempt to control it in any way, then we have to plan forward. Now, the plans we've got at the moment, the detailed local plans, some of which are now have been adopted, some of which are in the last stages of being adopted, go through to 2031 or 2036. So what we're looking at is what emerges beyond that in the period, as been explained, up to 2050. Inevitably, its estimates have to be made of what that growth will be in that period up there, and therefore the view taken by the MAG is that it will be at least an extrapolation at the similar rates to what we will expect to see in the next 10 or 15 years, which seems to be reasonable. No one outside that I'm aware of has come up with an alternative proposal, and certainly nobody, I think, can possibly take the view that there'll be no growth at all. So if you've got to plan for significant growth, the question therefore is how do you do it, and where you're going to put it in an already well built up city and significantly well built up neighbourhoods in the market towns. Well, our experience of doing the local plans has shown that there's considerable feeling amongst people who live in the county that they don't want to see villages expanded significantly beyond their current sizes, because to do that then it changes the whole character of them, and we're getting certainly at the local level significant resistance when large sites are put forward adjacent to villages that have been used to living within a certain framework, certain size. Their amenities match that. If you come along and say we're going to expand your village and double it, or even put only 50% more houses, there's considerable opposition. So what this plan is attempting to do, from a strategic point of view, is to say that whilst there will be growth in these non-strategic sites, some of which will be villages, some of which will be other sites, there needs to be a significant proportion of that growth accommodated in new strategic sites. And of course, if you do identify new strategic sites, then you have to provide the infrastructure to connect them together. Which brings me to the controversial view of the expressway. We have a significant problem in the county that our north-south routes are reasonably efficient, particularly the motorway, or the motorway, of course, is going to be expanded soon to 4 lanes all the way through. But when you try to go east to west, you run into all kinds of problems. There's also, of course, this strategic national view of a need for an expressway all the way down to Exeter up to the northeast of Lincolnshire, and of course it would have to go somewhere through Leicestershire if that's to be achieved. So bringing those things together, the proposal to bring the A46 around the south of Leicestershire seems to be a reasonable proposition to bring forward, and that's what the Members' Advisory Group has done. When you examine it further and realise the benefits to settlements near to its route and to the opportunities for building new strategic settlements, it then becomes a much more compelling prospect. However, I am aware that there are views around from people who currently live near what they think might be the route, which of course has not yet been chosen and couldn't possibly be at this stage, and say, well, actually it's only going to be 100 metres away from my house, I'm not having that. And if you take that sort of very narrow perspective, what you're saying is that the personal considerations of a handful of people go against the greater needs of probably 1 million people living in the county as a whole. And indeed, if you don't plan for strategic settlements, as has been proposed in this plan, then you end up with every bit of growth going into non-strategic, into expansion of villages, so everybody gets it, and with no infrastructure at all, which only adds to the congestion on rural roads, which we already see quite a lot of. I think the first of these alternatives to plan for something which does actually manage movements of people and movements of goods and services in a more sensible way by use of a strategic road makes a lot more sense. Secondly, if we look towards the building of that, which will be in the 2030s, and then on towards 2040s and 50, we have to remember that technology is changing. When we get beyond 2040, there will be no more vehicles sold with internal combustion engines in this country. That's been the decision of the Department of the Environment. Everything will have gone electric by that point. So many of our health problems that we get from road traffic will disappear. Also, of course, with the automation of cars and vehicles, the roads should be a lot safer, and control of vehicles should be done much more electronically. And so it becomes a much safer prospect to move independently in road transport than it does at the moment. So I'm very much an enthusiast for what's being put forward here, and I recognise, and all of us must recognise, that this is a strategic plan, and taken into the future it will then gradually have more detail developed alongside it, and of course it will move into the districts, who will then put their local plans forward, which will determine where any new settlements are going to go, where the expansion of existing settlements should be, and we'll have further debates, many of them in the years ahead. As I said at the start of the meeting, I expect to be here for an awful long time, so I could well be part of that, and I hope many of you will be too. Well, I hope this afternoon there is a sensible view taken. Certainly my own view is that this should be supported with enthusiasm by the County Council, and I hope that all the members around this table will share that view at the end of the discussion. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Byron. So that's completed all the introductions. That has taken us an hour and a quarter, so I now want to move on to have a discussion and allow members to question the panel, and also to test and probe some of the assumptions both in the plan and that have been made this afternoon. Could I just draw members' attention also to the three submissions that are in your agenda papers? Firstly, from the CPRE, Campaign for Protection of Rural England. Very comprehensive submission there. Also one from Shelter. That's in our packs, and also one from our own Public Health department. So I think that there may be questions members want to bring out and ask officers to respond to of issues being raised there. So I'd like to open it up, and if I refer you to the piece of paper on the table, we've blocked this into sort of three areas and then a number of subheadings. So the first one, and we've referenced that to the plan. So the first one we're going to focus on is the four priorities in the plan. And if I could start with a question to get us rolling then on this securing the essential infrastructure and the confidence that we have that this is going to happen. And if I might refer to a piece of evidence that was recently published by East Midlands Councils as to where, never mind we sit in Leicestershire, but where we sit in the East Midlands. And that work showed that we have the lowest level of public expenditure on economic affairs. We have the lowest level of public expenditure on transport in total per head, the lowest level of public expenditure on rail per head, the third lowest on health, the third lowest on education, etc., etc. In all areas, we talk about the Midlands engine, West Midlands beats us hands down in terms of infrastructure. So perhaps you'd like to start with this, Nick, because presumably you've got some contacts in government where this is going to have to come from. Where is the confidence coming from that we are going to get this level of investment in the infrastructure? It states in the plan that it's critical. In other words, if we don't get it, the plan's not deliverable. So I'd like your view on that as well. But in overall terms, this is not something that we can will, is it? Within the county council, we can't just budget for it. Where is this money going to come from?
Sure. Well, it is recognised, Simon, that the East Midlands is particularly poorly funded on a number of levels, and the West Midlands beats us hands down. And if you want to go to the nth degree, if you look at London, we're completely dwarfed. You know, they can announce a Crossrail for $6 billion, and they can't afford apparently money to electrify our railway. But you know, that is where we are, and as you know, Simon, the East Midlands is trying its best to raise its profile. We are members of Midlands Connect, we are members of the Midlands Engine, and the point is continually made that the East Midlands, and it's not just us, I mean, you know, you've got even worse areas than us, you've got Lincolnshire, for instance, right on the periphery, but it is a point well made. But moving forward, if we do not have this sort of plan adopted, we will not only get nothing in terms of infrastructure, we will also end up like the guy from the City Council said, being told you're going to have them anyway. Because you've not got this plan, you've got to have 20% more. So that would be the worst case scenario, to have nothing, be at the mercy of developers and be told by the Secretary of State we've got to have 20% more. Or the Secretary of State could say, being as we couldn't agree as a group of districts, county and SPS in the city, they may well give it to the LEP and say, here you go, LEP, the councils can't agree, the growth plan, let the LEP do it. So let's go. I think this is good work that the people have done, like I said to start with. And infrastructure should follow housing growth at this level, because in my view it is slightly above trend for a start-up. So, you know, we are showing huge amounts of housing growth. 190,000 houses we're projecting between now and 2051, which we all admit is a lot, and it has taken a lot of compromises from a lot of districts to accommodate it, not only their own growth, but also to help out the city, which is what, in my view, as a county, we should do, because although it's the city mayor is the mayor of the city is our city. Our people go and work there. I go to the cinema there. I might live in northwest Leicestershire, but the city is our city as much as it is the city resident city. So I think this is a blooming good plan. Investment should follow growth, and that is how we're going to get it, because without it we'll have nothing plus more growth.
Anybody want to add anything? Anne, could you add anything about the process by which particularly the expressway will achieve funding? You know, what is the government process it has to go through? How does it have to compete with other schemes?
Ultimately, to deliver something like the expressway, you need to get into Highways England's RIS, Road Investment Strategies. You know, they have 5-year rolling programmes of those, so you need to get into those. Ultimately, again, and just echoing what the leader said, without a clear plan of actually, one, what's needed, and agreed to, actually you stand very little chance of doing that. So, and the more you have in terms of weight, so if Midlands Connect is saying, you know, this is a priority for the region and, you know, it has an impact nationally, if we're saying at county and city level, this is a real priority for us, the more weight you've got in achieving that. Ultimately, again, I think the reality is we'd very much expect some developer contributions to this road as it comes forward, but primarily would seek to get into the Highways England RIS process. Fundamentally, that starts because none of this is quick, as I alluded to earlier. That starts with you need to get in there with development funding, so they need to do the early feasibility study. So you would aim to get into a RIS period, and as I say, they're five-year blocks for the development funding. Depending on how that goes, then the business case then is established for that. Then you would actually seek entry into the following RIS period for the start of construction, etc. So that's actually the process that works. We'd expect, however, that something this scale again, we would look for opportunities ourselves where we could augment that with the likes of local growth funding or any other government funding scheme that comes as well.
So, Simon, just to say, on the expressway, it's not just in our growth plan, it's not just in Midlands Connects and Midlands Engine, it's in all growth plans. So we may have odd discussions about what roundabouts look like and roads off it and that sort of stuff, but the strategic vision for the expressway, hopefully eventually to be called the Fossway, so we know what it is, is in everybody's growth plans from down in the south, west, right to the northeast, and that is the strength of the bid for the Fossway expressway.
Okay. Grant, did you want to come in?
Just very briefly to add to that is each local plan needs to have an infrastructure study, a list of infrastructure to support its local plan growth. So effectively to have an approved growth plan, strategic growth plan, then the inspector of each local plan will also review and argue for the need for the infrastructure. So that's a further level where the need for the infrastructure is tied in very closely into the development, just to add to the point that Anne made.
Okay, thank you. Right, I've got Michael Charlesworth first.
Thank you, Chair. And just a couple of points really on the first bit. It's what Nick's just said. Sort of a case of if we build it, they will come. I just worry that we'll build these 100,000 houses and the infrastructure money won't come. We're then left with massive problems with health, congestion, education. And that is an even worse case scenario than the one that Nick outlined with 20% more on the LEP taking charge of things. That would be worse for me. That would be concerning because we've seen the lack of investment by government in East Midlands, as Simon's already alluded to. We seem to be at the bottom of the list. I don't know why, but the principle of having this strategic growth plan is great. No problem with that at all. I just think it's slightly unrealistic as it sits at the moment. I suppose one of my other concerns is I don't know how long the MAG or people have been discussing this or when it started, but we only sort of became aware of it towards the end of last year. And as Campaign for England point out on page 54, the process, lack of local engagement in the plan's development. There's been a certain level of secrecy and don't disclose things and quite a furtive way of doing it, which I find not very transparent or democratic. Tell us what's going on. I mean, maybe our leaders not shared things with Obi and Wigston members. I don't know. I don't actually know how long it's been going on, but that they've pointed it out, and so am I. I think we need to be more transparent as we go forward, so we take everybody with us.
Can we,
Simon,
just on that,
yeah,
can you pick up specifically also, why won't there be a public, for any local plan, there'd be an independent examination of that plan by an inspector? I understand that's not going to be the case.
Well, Tom will explain that to you in detail in a minute. On the so-called secrecy, there is no secrecy. Obi and Wigston, of which I think your deputy leader, Michael, were part of the members' advisory group. And as you can see, Obi and Wigston can't help out much at all with housing because, again, you're as constrained as they are in the city. So there is no secrecy, I can promise you that. And you have been an active member. Well, maybe not you, I don't know who Obi Wigston sent, but they are on there. In terms of the delivering the houses without the road, well, you won't be able to. This strategy, it will be undeliverable without the A46 expressway stroke Fossway, because as you can see, a lot of it forms a defensible boundary between the city and the road, and that's where the majority of the houses are going to end up, inside, if you could see the map, just inside the road. And as you provide some of the housing, they will provide some of the funding towards the road. They'll certainly have to provide funding for schools, hospital, the normal stuff which goes through county council and district councils. But without the road, we'd be in a bit of a mess, really, because the numbers inside the road to help out not only the boroughs, say like Blaby and Hinkley, Bosworth, Harborough, but also some of the numbers that are coming from the city are going to be encompassed inside the A46 expressway stroke, hopefully to be called the Fossway. But Tom will explain why there's no whatever you asked for.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, just on that point. This is a non-statutory strategic growth plan. So there's, it's a voluntary exercise of all of the partners to help us discharge the duty to cooperate, so that we can plan effectively across the wider area. So there's no requirement for us to produce a plan like this. We could fulfil the duty to cooperate in other ways, but we think this is the most effective and most strategic way of doing that. But as a non-statutory plan, there's no provision or requirement to hold a public examination. The highest formal level, if you like, of the planning system are the local plans, and it's that's the highest statutory level of planning, and it's at that level where there's formal examination or inspection and testing of proposals at that level. Now, it is true that we could carry out, if you like, a mock examination in public, but I think the judgment that's been taken is that would be an expensive exercise, which would probably have limited impact on the decisions that are taken later on. So, because it's not something that's built into the formal planning system at the moment.
So to be clear, you call it a mock, but we have the powers as a local authority to hold or local authorities to hold a public inquiry and invite an independent inspector to do that, to look over the plan, do we?
I mean, I think how I would rephrase it is that we have it within our own gift to consult on the plan as we see wish, and if we wanted to organise something which looked like a public examination, then we could do that. But it wouldn't have any formal status, I think is what I'd say.
Okay, that's helpful. Right, I've got David Jennings and then David Bill.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think most of what's been said this afternoon I already knew, but it doesn't please me, quite frankly. But we have to be realistic. Sometimes we counters make decisions that don't please people. Sometimes we make decisions that don't please ourselves. But this nation is faced with a problem. No, everybody wants extra houses, but nobody wants them near them, where they live. This afternoon, we're only dealing with a broad brush. We have no details. We suppose we eventually end up each of the districts taking the responsibility for a certain number of houses. A century ago, my maternal grandfather was a builder in Leicester, and he built large parts of Leicester. I didn't know, I was only 2 when he died. East Park Road, Smith Dorring Road, all of them were built by my grandfather. And the city's grown, everything's grown, everything's changed. And one thing I do welcome is having a plan, because it gives us something to work to. We may not like it, but it's better to have a plan than not have a plan. Too many decisions have been made recently by government planning inspectors, and they've all lacked something because it's local knowledge. They don't know what we know. And I think we have to grasp the metal and make some decisions and decide where building is going to take place. And I believe to have a document like this is the proper thing to do. It may not please us, but with the amount of housing, in the past, 10 years, we've had 5 governments with Conservative, Labour, Liberal and our DUP involved, and they've all wanted more housing. I don't think we can dispute that. The exact figure's not known, but we must plan for the future. And the key thing is infrastructure. I live on Station Road in Countersthorpe, and I'm the last house on Station Road before Waterloo Crescent. And a resident there showed me some documents from when the properties were built in the 1930s. And the selling feature was that these houses were just 12 minutes away from the centre of Leicester by a Rugby mainline train. You try to get into Leicester now from Countersthorpe in 12 minutes. Doesn't work, does it? The thing is, the roads, the infrastructure, and this expressway, one of the proposals I've seen is that the 20A would be in the division that I represent. We don't know the final details yet. I'm not saying now that I'm opposed to that. I may have some comment to make when we know the details, but we've got to grasp the metal and face up to facts. We have a problem, and if we don't solve it, who will? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a statement, really.
Well, I welcome it because David, although he might be badly affected if he does get the junction, he has grasped the vision thing. This is strategic, long-term vision, which we're supposed to get out there, which will generate growth, economic growth, housing growth, and infrastructure growth. And it just shows us how well we can work together. You know, again, I can't keep emphasising it. 6 Tory boroughs, a Liberal borough, a Labour city mayor, all coming together to do the vision thing.
David Bill.
Thank you, Chairman. I was caught a little bit unawares by the new information that we were presented with this afternoon. The environmental asset plan is new to me. It's not in the package of papers that we received. And
you
also
mean the environmental impact assessment?
Whatever it's called, yes.
Yeah, I don't think that's available yet.
It came up and disappeared like Facebook does.
We'll get some clarity on where that is.
It is rather important. And there was a series of road plans as well, which I tried to identify, but I didn't recognise what I saw on the plan with what I know to be on the ground. So unless it's changed, we really do need to know what we're actually meant to be asked to support this afternoon. We really need to see these plans in detail before we can actually, well, I can't, you know, I'm not going to agree to a plan unless I've actually seen it. I mean, you wouldn't do that on a planning committee. You'd, if you were putting up a storm porch, you'd actually look at the plan before agreeing it. Here, we're looking at a massive schemes with massive implications. We really do need to look at it properly. Could I just check? At the last Scrutiny Commission, Nick, you said that we need this growth in order, I know it's not the only factor, but you actually said we need this growth in order to compensate for the lack of funding that we receive in this county. And you, Chairman, listed all the factors which we're bottom of the league or near the bottom of the league. Was that just a throwaway remark, or was that an actual, you know, is that part of the strategy?
Well,
okay, so we've got two points there. You're going to respond on that, and then Pat's going to respond on the environmental
Super. Well, there's one thing for certain. David Bill doesn't get the vision thing at all. He wants to see absolutely everything in detail, and I respect that you're opposed to growth, and you're opposed to housing, you're opposed to roads.
I don't think he said that. I think that's a bit unfair, Nick.
I haven't actually mentioned housing yet, Chairman. We'll come to that later on, perhaps.
But you certainly don't get the vision thing, David, that's for sure, whereas other members, I think, do. In regards to money, this stuff will deliver infrastructure, is the point I was making. If we don't get some of the infrastructure, as I've said before, for the new Fossway Stroke Expressway, the strategy of the housing growth is not sustainable. We'd have to revisit it, and you could end up, I suppose, with the worst case scenario that Byron outlined. There's lots and lots of heavy growth in villages, relying on the roads that and infrastructure that they've got. And then you wanted to ask them.
Yes, please, Pat.
On the question of the environment plan, the only reason why that's not included within the consultation draft plan is we simply can't reproduce that information in that scale of document. We have, however, included the environment plan in the exhibition panels, which all local authorities are consulting on, and the information contained in that is a direct transfer of GIS information that's held by all of the local authorities on a whole host of environmental matters. Very happy to answer any questions on that, but it was purely the question of difficulty reproducing it in that document.
But a local plan would have an environmental impact assessment to accompany it, wouldn't it? Is this plan having one of those?
Well, that's a completely separate thing. The plan that I showed today was the environmental assets plan, which is on the website and in the consultation panels. The other document that you're talking about is the sustainability appraisal, strategic environmental assessment, and we've just received a final draft of that document, so that needs to go through strategic planning group and be made available to members, and then we can publish that online as part of the evidence base. So I think we're talking about two separate things here.
Okay, so on the second one then, on the SA, will that be available during the consultation process?
It should be available within a few days. Yes,
in the next few days?
Yes, well within the consultation period.
Okay. David, did you?
Series of questions, Chairman. I've been longing to ask these questions since about July when this first came out, and despite what was said this afternoon, we have been told that we must not talk about this. This is the first time, in fact, it's come out in this form. It's the first time it's come to a meeting of this council. And of course, it hasn't been agreed by the districts. What's been agreed is that it should go out for consultation. As far as I'm aware, that's still the case. I don't know whether any district has stamped this through already, but I would have thought that most districts would actually wait until the end of the consultation period before giving an opinion. Could I ask about the prospectus for growth? Now, this came out some months ago, and we're all familiar with it. But can I ask, has that been submitted to the government or government departments yet, and have we had a response? Do we know whether this has been received favourably? Have we had an opinion on it, or is it still sort of on somebody's desk waiting for approval?
Anne, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, we have submitted it to DFT. However, that's for information. We're not expecting a response from them. They will expect us to go through whatever process in order to secure that infrastructure as it comes forward, either via growth and development, via funding streams that come forward, etc., or working with the likes of Highways England or Network Rail. We don't expect a response from them. It's not for them to vet. It's purely about us working with the partners about what we want to see happening in Leicestershire. We don't require a response from DFT. Any response would be in the form of a response to a bid when they have a funding stream available.
David, do you want to come back?
Sorry, I do have a lot of questions. I don't want to dominate this and I'll let other people have a say, but I would have thought we would need to have some indication about whether the plan itself is likely to receive approval before wasting yet more money on another grandiose plan. Because this is what happens, isn't it? We have spent millions in this place putting forward bids for this, that and the other, all of which come to nothing. But anyway, can I ask about Hedna? Going back to the first principles, if you look at Hedna, and that was accepted here 9 months ago or so, or even longer, one of the principles in that, and it was set out, was that it would take account of various factors, including local aspiration. Now, can I please ask, how has local aspiration been taken into account in this exercise so far? I know that the county has listened to what the MAG members have said, but as far as I'm aware, the MAG members haven't been out to their constituent members of the community to ask their opinion. I mean, the consultation has started, but to what degree has local aspiration been taken into account in this exercise?
I'm sure when David talks about aspiration, he means objections. But
I'm quoting from the. Forgive me while I look for my papers, but the Hedna document, the first page, says that objectively assessed housing need, which will lead through to the housing target, which is what we've calculated up there, or somebody's done it, has to take account of a number of factors: unmet needs from other areas, sustainability appraisal, land capacity, aligning housing and economic strategy, and then local aspiration. Now, if we're to approve the next stage, which is taking it on from Hedna to the strategic growth plan, all I'm asking for, has that step of taking account of local aspiration as set out in the Hedna report, which this authority commissioned, has that
I think what you're referring to is taking the base figures that you get, what assumptions have been made. So a number of districts have chosen to go for higher figures, haven't they, than their objectively assessed needs, so that either to create a buffer or for aspiration. Do you assume that in arriving at the figures for the growth plan?
Could I just take this a bit more slowly? First of all, when we were undertaking the HEFNA, we went through that process I've described about starting with population, looking at prospects for economic growth, and then affordability adjustments. When we were looking at the economic adjustments, Oxford Economics, who were part of the team, started with national forecasts, regional forecasts, and then they looked at the characteristics of each of the local economies, and they consulted with economic development officers and planners within each of the individual local authorities before they identified the likely scope for economic growth within each of the areas. And that work is reflected in the document. In terms of the growth and development of the strategic growth plan and the consultation that took place around that, the members' advisory group is there as a voice for each of the authorities. But we did publish the strategic growth statement in August 2016, and the dissemination of information, both upwards to MAG and downwards to individual authorities, was organised by the individual MAG member. I happen to know there's quite a lot of variation in the way that consultation process took place. Some local authorities had a standing item of briefing on the strategic growth plan as they reported on their own local plans. Others held one-off specific meetings. I attended some of those briefing meetings. And so therefore that consultation engagement process was organised within each of the local authorities themselves. And it was only when we were producing the major documents like the growth statement, the introductory document, and then the consultation draft plan that there was a public document produced, but there were briefings taking place within authorities to capture local views that led to the production of the final draft plan.
Right, okay. David, one more question, then let some more members come in.
So what we mean by local aspiration really is then consulting members and not further down. We're not consulting the members of the community. It is in other words, some MAG members kept it to themselves, others discussed it with council officers or economic officers and development officers, and others discussed it with members as a whole. But there was no sort of dissemination into the community. So again, as my colleague here, Michael, has said, there hasn't been a sort of widespread consultation with the affected communities. Not yet, anyway.
Tom, do you want to?
Well, I think that's the process we're in at the moment with consultation on the draft strategic growth plan. So that consultation is underway. That's a public consultation, and there was a public consultation at the earlier strategic growth statement stage as well. Obviously, that was a higher level document without detailed numbers in it, but the principles, if you like, an approach that was likely to be taken was consulted on then. So there is public consultation underway at the current time.
Okay, Terry Inan.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think I'm beginning to understand what the point of this is, and I'm going to stick to the first section, Chair, which is the 4 priorities in the plan. And I guess that what this is to do, this whole plan, is about securing essential infrastructure. It's about having something that we can then go and put under the noses of people in Westminster and say, look, we have a plan. Can we have some resources? I just wanted to go back a couple of steps, I think, in my own thinking, because when we're looking at the priorities, these seem to be, strategic priorities, rather than, for me, thinking about why on earth are we doing all of this? And that's where my question then comes from, is a recognition that people need to have houses, that they have the resources to live in. Now, one of those resources, of course, is wealth, and Shelter have put a comment in, which is well worth reading, about the lack of really any focus on affordability, and by that I mean not affordability in the sense that it often, in there are places in Colville, they're building affordable homes. There's something like 250,000, doesn't compute in an area with low incomes. But also with Byron's point, we're all living longer, but we're not always living much healthier. People's extended age is often at a point of great disability. So I haven't seen anything much in here about accessible homes as well as affordable homes. And the other points came up from reading what the public health team have put in. People need to have houses they have the resources to live in, but they also need to be near employment that they can afford to travel to. And again, coming back to a point well made by Byron, not without relying on the internal combustion engine, because with any luck the world will change. And there's a good comment again by Public Health on the importance of that, because I think from a public health point of view, if we can achieve both of those things, then people will be themselves wealthier and healthier. They will not be being poisoned by poor air quality. They will be taking exercise, etc., and all the things that our public health team want. And that is the virtuous circle, I would have thought, of growth that we should be looking for. And if we're not careful, we will have growth that is actually wasteful activity, as people commute from areas where we've built houses to areas where we've put employment along roads rather than using any form of public transport. I'm really pleased that we're doing something, a little teensy bit of something about rail, Leicester to Coventry, very nice. I think you'd be all upset if I didn't mention the National Forest line, because I have to. And the campaign for better transport, again, would wish me to. So my question, though, Chair, is how are we going in this plan to look at whether or not the housing we are putting in and the employment that we are putting in are married up in a way that would satisfy my public health colleagues, that we're not going to be having people commuting up and down or more than they are at the moment?
Right. Anne, do you want to start on that one?
I'll start, no doubt others may want to comment as well. I mean, fundamentally, when it comes down to the planning application stage, obviously we require a transport assessment, and we will be looking at all forms of transport, which is what we do as a matter of course. So that's looking at cycle connections, walking connections, what's required in terms of public transport. So that will go at that level. We will, at the individual application level, that would be identified. Over and above that, I would say one of the interesting things I think you pointed to was, you know, as we're living longer, as technology changes, actually what will transport look like in the future? Well, actually, we're getting into the realms of a bit of crystal ball gazing. However, very much regardless of what the technology is, be that, you know, automated vehicles, you know, driverless vehicles, etc., we don't need to drive anymore. As you get older, you can see that being a major benefit. People can still get about, have social interaction. That's all about quality of life and health and well-being, etc. It still requires space in order to facilitate that. At the moment, we call them roads, and yes, they can facilitate cars and buses and cyclists, etc. It may be a different form of technology, but we still need to cater for that space in the future. I mean, overall, as I say, we will look across the board at what's required in terms of that mix of transport. What the latest technology will enable us to facilitate for connectivity. I think the other thing to bear in mind as well is actually the allocations. It's where we're putting the development, isn't it? So if we've got housing and employment, and making sure that they are accessible to each other is a key thing. We all know we've got challenges at the moment, for instance, with things like East Midlands Airport, and how are we making sure that people can get to the jobs there? It's about building that in now. We've got a better chance of being able to do that when we've got a longer term vision. We know where the housing's going, we know where the employment's going, we can develop those plans, we're clear, developers know what's expected of them, and it's far easier to achieve that because we've got a coherent plan around that. Will be challenging, however, we're putting in place the building blocks to be able to ensure that we're looking across the board at all transport modes that equal, you know, accessibility in all forms.
Okay. Simon, can I have to? I mean, Dr. Annie makes a good point. I mean, we need homes near jobs, which is a very positive contribution. We need homes people can afford, obviously, and affordability is relative compared to where you are. It's a given. We certainly need them near facilities, and we certainly need the facilities like health, like schools. You know, that is a given and something I can support. We also need good connectivity, as Anne's alluded to, and good connectivity just doesn't mean roads, it just doesn't mean rail, it means internet connectivity, it means connectivity where people can meet and that sort of stuff. So I welcome Dr. Ryan's support, and her comments are taken on board.
Okay, she wants to come back, but Grant, I mean, I think we're interested to hear about what we can do. I mean, my concern is that this is a bit car dependent at the moment, where it's all about roads and so on. So over the years, there's been plans to have trams. I can remember 10 years ago, the COT wanted to have a tram, but they didn't want to pay for it, so it never happened. So what's the city's thinking on how to deal with congestion and get more people onto public transport?
I'll answer that. Maybe provide a little bit of answer to the questions that you asked about what's in this plan and what's in the local plans. Because if you remember previous local plans, the first chapter was always about compliance with the structure plan or compliance with the regional spatial strategy, and then the other 12, 15 chapters about what you want to do in the place. And I think the way that I'd characterise this is that the first chapter in your local plans as they come forward will say, well, are we in general compliance with the strategic plan? And then it will go into all the standards, the housing mix, whether you want accessible housing, whether you want to go for the wheelchair standard, because that finer grain policy is all done in the local plan. So that was, I guess, the point I was trying to make. And I think the same applies to your point about transport. If you think about a strategic growth plan strategy which specified modal targets across the whole of Leicester and Leicestershire, wouldn't be very meaningful, because the accessibility in the city is very different from Colville or very different from the rural villages. So again, I think the local plans will look at the package of infrastructure to support the growth and the sites in the local plans, including maximising public transport accessibility, maximising that, reducing the need to travel by allocating sites near to your local stations or near to your local hubs or town centres. So a lot of that integration, I think, comes down at in the local plan stage, and that's what we're looking to do. And again, I guess the strategic principles of this and the strategic direction, and again the apportionment of numbers, is the main purpose of this from my perspective, if that helps.
Do you want to come back, Terry?
Thank you, Chair. That was very helpful, because that was related to my supplementary question, which is that there needs to be some kind of backwards and forwards between this plan. That one of the things I'm concerned about, in the sense, is that by the time we get to 2031, the North West Leicestershire local plan, which obviously I know well, will have been continuing to run its course, and there are aspects in that which have led to us having even very low levels of affordable homes, 7.5% in one large place, and which is terrible. And if we carry on down that road, is that going? Where will we be in relation to this plan in 2031? There are also good things in that plan, like there is an aspiration for the reopening of the National Forest line to passenger transport, which hasn't made it into this plan, and therefore will not be the kind of thing that's going to go under the noses of Chris Grayling. And I think that's going to be quite disappointing. So strategically, I think we need to be somehow tying up the vision in here with the visions that precede it in each of the local plans.
Right. Who wants to come back? I mean, I think the whole transport thing seems to be on this one road. Is there no vision beyond the expressway in terms of trying to get people? I mean, I appreciate it's got to be linked to local plans, but there doesn't seem to be any vision about getting people out of cars or aspirations or alternative modes.
I mean, we don't always want to go on about the Ivenow line, but I mean, the Ivenow line is an aspiration for a great many of us, but without government funding, government money, and it being part of a franchise, it's nothing that we'll ever get to see. I have written to Chris Grayling and had a reply, but it needs to be part of a franchise. County councils can't run and build railways anymore. We struggle to look after old people and children, with our increasing responsibilities to divert time and resources to running a railway line, which would, even if we got the money to run it, would require a 5 million subsidy, is not something that I could recommend to this council in the present economic climate. But Byron wants to talk about a couple of other things.
It's a transport route, isn't it? This route, and I think one of the valuable things that's coming out of this discussion, and if you like, the Scrutiny Commission is adding value to, which is why we do these sort of things, is that these points can be made. There's to my mind, a case for the members' advisory group moving further forward now and looking at a technological paper to see what the impact of technology in future years will have on the growth in Leicestershire. And it's not just the movement of people, but of course it's also the applications of of broadband and indeed the faster broadband which is emerging as well, and other communication links, and the way that's going to alter employment patterns. So I think if you in your report make those points, I think those are the sort of things that we'll look at.
Thank you. Anne wanted to come back, and then Pat.
Thanks very much. What we would want to emphasise is, I know there's a lot of focus on the A46, and hopefully I've outlined for members of the committee, the Midlands Connect thinking about the benefits of that and what it will deliver in terms of this particular strategic growth plan, i.e. opening up land for development. However, what we haven't done, and this is the work that's going on with the modelling, etc., and will keep going on, as I said, because we will have a process over time, is look at, for instance, how that land that's opened up for development will then be connected into the city. And we all know that actually the reality is that will not be predominantly by car movement, because it just physically won't be possible. So that work will be looking at what are the public transport solutions to make that connectivity into the city, into the services that people need, be that education, be that medical, be that shopping, whatever, jobs. And that work is still to happen. So I know at the moment the focus appears to be on it's all hung on one road. I would very much say that will not be the case. And actually, there's a lot of work that will come out over time to augment that, to show the bigger picture of what's required really to make this sustainable development. And what I would say, the fact that you actually have got the levels and volumes of growth we're talking about, and I know that's particularly sensitive, I absolutely understand that. However, it does make it easier to provide for some of these other sustainable transport modes and to get that critical mass to really make those viable. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I appreciate, however, the focus appears to be on a road at the moment, but actually over time I very much think that will change.
Pat.
There's a very long list of things that we could include in a strategic plan. In this plan, what we decided to do was to focus on the need for housing, infrastructure and employment, and to balance that against the environmental assets, the environmental constraints that we have, so that we don't damage the best of what we have. And the reason why we're focusing on housing, employment and the infrastructure that's needed to support that, primarily transportation infrastructure, is because they're really they're the big land uses. They're the ones that you have to sort out spatially. And you need to have an understanding of just what the scale of growth is likely to be in order to understand its impact. In terms of positioning housing relative to employment areas, we've tried to do that in the plan, and that's why there is a concentration of development in and around the edges of the city, and also why we have a northern and a southern gateway is because we recognise that there are existing employment and economic generators in those areas, which in other places we've all said that we wanted to support. And we know that there are commuting problems between the city and some of these employment areas. There's a lot of out-commuting from the city. So one of the reasons why we're trying to disperse that is to respond to that. So give people the opportunity to live closer to their places of work if they choose to. And for us it was about trying to get those big parts of the jigsaw sorted. And then once you actually get those sorted, some of the other matters that you've quite properly raised today can be dealt with in local plans or dealt with through other strategies that each of the constituent organisations is preparing anyway, or other stakeholder organisations are preparing. But this is about us saying this is a scale of development that we think we're likely to have to deal with over the next 35 years. Some of it we know, up to 2031, is already being accommodated through permissions and local plans, but there is another amount that's coming further down the line. And how do we plan for that to avoid a situation whereby we have the same amount of development spread sporadically across the whole of Leicester and Leicestershire, in all likelihood without a significant scale of infrastructure investment. So it's about getting those big picture items understood and recognised and thinking about how you deal spatially with those.
Rosita, you're next.
Thank you. I think I must keep it short because we need to move on. Going on the priorities, and I'm very glad this is being recorded because in my community people are extremely concerned about infrastructure, and it's nice to see that the reassurance is giving that everything is being done to secure that infrastructure. And the points I had have been really taken care of. There is connectability and all maximum efforts are being made. Now, the fourth point of the priorities, by maintaining the essential qualities and delivering high-quality development, I'm sure you are not talking about bricks and mortar as such. You are talking about the other points Councillor Einan has just mentioned. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit? And I've got one more point. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in a previous draft, there was a fifth priority, which, if I can remember rightly, was to protect the landscape and the heritage, and it featured very highly. In fact, on the 4th of January, the Secretary of State in a speech mentioned protecting the landscape and the heritage. So unless it was in a different document, but I'm sure the growth plans priority 5 was that. But anyway, my question is, with all that development, how in your priorities and the overarching are you proposing to protect our assets rather than them being constraints, but to enhance them and to preserve them?
I don't think there was ever a fifth priority around landscape. What there is in the plan, and it's still there, is a fifth building block, which is about environmental assets. And we talk about that's still there. We don't have a plan, but there is a section in the document about environmental assets. And when we're talking in the plan about environmental constraints, it's an environmental matter which constrains growth rather than growth being constrained by an environment, rather than the other way around. So what we're saying is the environment is important. We want to look after the environmental and cultural assets of Leicester and Leicestershire because they're one of the things that makes it a great place to live. So we've got to protect those. So it was the fifth building block of the strategy. And the other thing is, in terms of focus, Grant's just pointed up, in the section called Planning for Our Future, we do talk about having a key matter of protecting our environment and built heritage. Just as I said, we can't deal with absolutely everything in this plan, but what we do in the plan is we lay the foundations for an agenda built around garden suburbs, garden towns and villages, because they allow us to introduce an agenda which brings together social, economic and environmental considerations. It's about quality of design, it's about the quality of place that people live in, but it's also about the social and economic opportunities that they have. So the plan doesn't specify detailed standards in the way you might expect in a local plan. But what we would like to do is to take that concept further and look at how we can protect the best of our environments and enhance those environments, but also ensure that we get the best standards coming forward from developers and using that Garden Cities, Garden Towns agenda as a way of raising those standards.
Could you come back for the definition of delivering high-quality development?
Well, it would be done through developing an agenda that has its starting point of garden cities that bring forward a whole host of considerations, from design standards to social and economic services that support the development. I think I'm missing your point here. I'm trying to answer, but I'm not quite sure I'm doing so.
No, that's it.
Right, I've got Terry Edridge next.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think at the moment we're in the worst possible place at the moment, aren't we? We have piecemeal development on our villages and towns, which nobody wants, nobody likes, and doesn't bring actually any infrastructure with it. What this plan gives us an opportunity for is to actually be bold in our vision, which is why we're elected. And I take David Bill's point about consultation, but we are elected to make decisions. We're not elected every time to say, well, I don't know what to do, let's go and ask the public again. So what we've been asked to do here, and the key word is strategic. We've been asked to look strategically at what might be achieved in Leicestershire which may bring in the infrastructure we all desperately need. No one in this room has mentioned that we don't need infrastructure. Now, the only way we're likely to achieve infrastructure is to actually be bold in that vision and say, yes, we will go for strategic sites. Now, there's a perfect example in New Loversthorpe, which got the infrastructure before it started. It got the bridge over the motorway. It's got the second bridge coming. So it can be done. But that only came about because it was a vision for a strategic site, which wasn't very popular, I freely admit. And, this to me is what we would consider the least worst alternative. Nobody wants it because nobody wants houses. But if we're going to have them, let's plan them properly. Let's do the things we need to do, which is, we talked about here, which is get the houses near the work, make sure that commuting journeys are small. But I feel that we've been discussing too much in detail here. What we're talking about is if this is approved by all the constituent councils, and it hasn't gone through anywhere yet, and it will come back, it will then be formed and go into their local plans. And these people will correct me if I'm wrong. Local plans might be done to 2031, but they're redone every 2 or 3 years, so they don't just work to 2031. Local plans will be updated on the basis of this document, should it be agreed. That's what then goes out to local public consultation. That's what gives the accuracy of where things will go and how they will be developed. That's when we go to that local consultation we desperately need at that local level to make sure it fits in. But we know when we're doing that, it's within an overall vision and a scope. Now, if, we want to leave a legacy to our grandchildren and those that come after them, let's for once try and be bold in our vision. Let's try and plan for our area and do the best we can. And when we talk about high quality development, the best way to get it is to have a larger development which has a design code for the whole development, which then does give that high quality housing, rather than what we get at the moment is 50 houses here of one design, 40 houses there of another, which looks like a hodgepodge. And I feel that we're getting too much into the nitty-gritty, which is not what this document is about. This document is about accepting the principle of, is that the number of dwellings we're likely to need? And as has been said, it will be changed in the light of updated HEDNAs and other information. And then giving each local planning authority the ability to then to adjust that and meet their local needs and do that local consultation, which is all of us as elected representatives we so desperately want. So I, for once, fully support this. It's not without difficulties. A lot of my residents won't like it, but I don't actually see any other way forward for Leicestershire if we are to obtain the inward investment we desperately need.
Right.
Chairman,
I'm going to take that as a statement as well, because you haven't actually asked the question.
An excellent contribution and an excellent explanation of how things will go.
That's
and
fine, but that's
does show bold strategic vision.
But it's not scrutiny, is it? That is not scrutiny. Scrutiny is about trying to get underneath the issues. He's just made a statement, and that's not what we're here for.
Well, I agree with him entirely.
On this committee. Right, I'm keen to move on to the next section, which is the total quantum of houses. David, had you got a quick question on,
yes.
and we can move on to
yes, it is. It is the fact that I've not challenged the housing figures. That I think that will come later, but I do question the employment figures. It was mentioned, I think, by Pat earlier that we've looked at B1 and so on and B8, but we haven't looked at the strategic depots. Now, as far as I can see, as far as B8 is concerned, the plan actually says that we require 472 hectares. And looking around the county, I can see that we're pretty close to that kind of figure anyway. I mean, I'd like to see exactly where we are on that, because it's not clear to me when you flip over from B8 to these nationally desirable, whatever they're called, freight installations. Now they are coming on stream in some force, as we all know. Magna Park, which went down very well with the local community, has now pretty well been agreed. We've got a huge development at Bardon Hill. Another one at Castle Donington, and there are others around the county. There's something going on at Stoney Stanton, and all these are listed in the National Planning Infrastructure documents, so they're there. But although they are being approved of, it looks as if they're being approved of by the planning inspectorate. I can't see too much reference to them in the plan before us. So could I have some definition, please, of where we go from? Could we separate out B8, the B8 classification to the strategic freight depots, and is there any kind of feeling within the county, within this exercise that you're undertaking, about how many of these freight depots we actually need in the county? Not the one. I'm not talking about demand, because we know we're in the Golden Triangle. Because we are so close. We're within 2 hours of all the major ports. This is a very desirable place to be. We accept that, and there's a desire for developers to come and put these huge areas up. But is there any thought? Has any thought been given to the actual need of the county to house so much of this development?
Okay, so the level of B8.
Back at the end of 2014, the partners commissioned a study by a company called MDS Transmodal, and that was specifically to look at the logistics and distribution industry in the city and the county. A number of conclusions arose in that study. One was that there was a need for an additional strategic rail freight interchange somewhere within the county. No location was identified. They also concluded that there was a significant demand for additional strategic distribution facilities. So that's the next level down. And as Councillor Bill suggests, that was of the order of 472 hectares. And that figure was looked at again when the HEDNA was being produced, and was found to be a correct estimate of the need for those types of facilities. So that's the origin of that figure of 472. It was originally in the logistics and distribution study, reviewed at the time of the HEDNA and then endorsed at that time. And there is a specific requirement for one additional strategic rail freight interchange. And again, that comes from the original strategic distribution study.
Yes, but sorry, that can't be right. If B8, if the strategic freight depots, what do you want to call them, are included in that B8 classification, that means that there is a requirement or a demand for 472 hectares of strategic freight areas. But when you actually look at what we've got, you start to add up Magna Park and all the rest of them that I've just referred to, by my calculations, and I've been given no information about this, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but one of these freight depots alone, take the Castle Donington one, that's 780 acres, which I calculated this morning comes to 310 hectares. So that takes up 3/4 of that classification. But on top of that, we have all these others coming on stream. Magna Park, I think that's 500 hectares, is it, or 3 acres? Hectares. So if that is taking that as a guide, we must be now facing 2,000 hectares of development, which is already 1,500 hectares above your B8 demand that you have identified. There's a mismatch somewhere. We're being swamped, fair enough, because there's a demand for it. But have you taken that into account in this grand plan?
Pat?
A strategic rail freight interchange is a specific type of logistics and distribution facility, so it's always considered separately. It's the top level, if you like. It's the one where there's an expectation that it should be rail connected. So it's like the strategic rail freight interchange at the East Midlands Gateway. It's a specific type of strategic depot. The next level down is the large-scale strategic distribution facilities of the type that Magna Park, and that's what's the requirement of 472 for. And that figure of 472, I should say, is intended to be a minimum requirement rather than a maximum or a target to be reached. And then below that again, there is a local level of distribution facilities. So that's local services, local sheds, designed to serve local markets. So there are 3 levels of provision, all of which have to be satisfied.
Lord Chairman, obviously, I've been in favour of rail freight all my life, and I will always be so. I was backing the Ivanhoe line from day one, and I've been backing the restoration of railways throughout the country all my life, and will continue to do so. And if we can get freight onto the rail, that's great. And I'd love to see Elmsthorpe Station reopened with a couple of sidings put in. But what I'm pressing for is the desire to go back to rail freight, which I do support. Does that justify the total wiping out of the land adjacent to Burbage Common, which has to be
into a specific scheme?
But this is a massive specific scheme, which has
that's
which
a
I
national infrastructure.
Yes, but surely these nationally imposed schemes should be referred to in this plan if we are to make sense of it.
So let's be clear: we're not including schemes that are coming forward through the national infrastructure route in the growth plan. Is that right? We're not mentioning them. We're not assessing the impact of them.
Right. Yes.
So they're outside the scope of this plan. Is the answer?
So by agreeing this plan, we do so in the knowledge that there's another great plan coming beyond our control. Don't we have any say in that at all? I find this so bizarre.
I think we got the answer. That we can only give the correct answer as to what the situation is. And
it will be something called a nationally significant infrastructure project, and there's a formal process which is initiated, and all authorities are consulted as part of that process. There will be an examination in a public inquiry rather.
Grant, did you want to come in, and then we need to move on?
Very, very briefly, I just think that it's another example of something which it will be dealt with through each individual local plan. Again, if you're looking at site allocations on a borough by borough, district by district basis, the strategic growth plan is not in a position to do that. So again, I guess if you were looking to present a case through a local plan against an NSIP project, actually the growth plan would help you, because what the growth plan does is actually says we're actually looking to prioritise housing delivery, which is and actually that's the main thrust of what we're looking to deliver. And actually the growth plan would actually be able to help you resist development over and above the scale of demand identified. So that's my understanding of the way in which the arguments would work.
Come back quickly, Chairman. I believe that if you actually encourage employment over and above what you really need to satisfy local needs, you will simply encourage others to move into the area, and that will then jack up the need for more housing. It's a spiral which goes on, and I think we ought to address it.
Okay, we'll have to do it outside of this plan, though. Michael Charlesworth.
Mine was on the last section, Chair.
Okay. Byron.
Chairman, this meeting's now gone on for 2.25 hours. I should have been in another meeting, and I'd scheduled to be and expected to be at 4 o'clock, which I now won't go to. I must leave whatever happens at 4:30, no matter where you are.
Pardon?
I will leave at 4:30.
Okay.
I will have to do that.
Okay, well, that's fine, but this is a very big issue. It's significant for the council and for the residents. I am keen, however, to move on to the next section. David, is yours on this part? Okay, fine. So, did you want to come in, Rosita, and then we need to move on to the final two sections? Yeah, he's going to pick up.
I'd just like to come in on your last point, Pat. Is there not logically a need to work in the regional as well as the national within this, because it's not properly. I know Grant said it comes through your local plan, but government is placing an emphasis on railheads and whatever else. So if we are having, for instance, on top, and I only can again speak from national, if we are on top over allocating, then we are actually working counterproductive to national policy. So surely those two need to be dovetailed and taken into consideration together rather than individually.
I don't think we're talking here about an over-provision. Our own logistics study said that there was a need for something called a strategic rail freight interchange, which would be of a scale that it's a nationally significant infrastructure process, which has its own process for determination. Because of the scale of that process, if we were to identify a site, we would then move out of the strategy of a growth plan to identifying specific sites in our area. But as I say, that strategic rail freight interchange is something that's identified in our own study, and a site will have to be identified either by ourselves through local plans or will be put to us by a developer bringing a site to us, and then a formal consultation process will take place. The second level is it could be rail, it could be road, but it would be strategic. It's called strategic B8, and that's the minimum of 472 hectares, which Councillor Bill has referred to. And then below that, there's the local distribution level, so 3 levels.
A minimum up to 2050 over the region, over Leicestershire.
It's a minimum of 472 hectares up to 2036 across Leicester and Leicestershire.
Right, okay. So the total delivery then of the 90,600 and the way that's assessed using the HEDNA you spoke about. Now, I'm right in saying the government's going to be introducing some kind of national methodology for calculating housing need. What's going to be the impact of that on this plan? Will we have to redo this in accordance with the government's requirements in due course for the plan to hold, in terms of its acceptance?
I'll pick that up. The government's formula that they've consulted upon but not quite finalised, they've given indicative findings of what those numbers are going to look like, but on a shorter period. In the north, most of the planning authorities are going to have much lower numbers. In the south, much of the planning authorities are going to have much higher numbers. In the Midlands, our number is almost exactly the same. And I was in a meeting with planners from Derby and Nottingham last week, and that's their assessment too. So we don't know categorically, but I think our projection is the numbers will be about the same.
But to demonstrate that, it's about demonstrating it and going through a process, isn't it, to arrive at the objectively assessed need. Will we be required to go through a loop in order to adopt, if you like, those figures?
I think the process is that that standard methodology is a consultation at the moment. We are expecting government to formalise something of that ilk in the near future, however. And yes, we would have to go through the loop of undertaking that calculation, but it would be a piece of work that could be done very quickly. I mean, the government tells that they can do these in 3 or 4 in an afternoon, so it's a relatively quick piece of work. And as long as we can demonstrate that the number in our growth plan is very close to the number using the standard methodology, I can't see that we're going to have any problems, because what government's actually after is homing in on what that need actually is, and then ensuring that local authorities deliver on that. So as long as the two are consistent and we're planning to that level, then it should just be a question of satisfying that simple question.
Okay, and how much is migration and immigration into the county and the city? How much of the need is that? And in other words, what happens if that goes down with Brexit?
In the slides that I used in the presentation, I think I showed that the amount of growth that you can attribute to migration is actually a very small component of their overall need. The large figures are driven by changes in population characteristics. So, and in the HETNA, there is already provision is already made for a declining amount of migration, because Brexit was already known at the time the HETNA was in production. So there is an assumption that migration will reduce over a period of time. We have to keep these figures under review. We have to do that all the time. So if there are shifts, we will take account of those as we review the figures. But I come back to the point that migration is a very small component of the overall figure.
Okay, thank you for that. Anybody else on the total provision of 90,000? David.
Thank you, Chairman. My question closely relates to yours, but it is, as I see it, an umbrella plan that has been delivered with a number that's arrived at by a prescribed methodology. And with the very best will in the world, 90,600 is quite a precise number for 30-odd years ahead. So therefore, we can be pretty sure that this number is wrong. And I think everybody agrees that in the passage of time, we can't possibly get very close to the number. The question that concerns me is, how is this related to the individual local authorities' delivery of these numbers, and what flexibility is built in for the local authorities that over this passage of time may find the need for more or less, and that will affect the overall number that we've arrived at, which we agree is wrong. And I'm a bit worried about the balance of it all.
Chairman, can I just make a few comments on the number? The number will almost certainly be wrong. That's the nature of it, but that is the nature of local plans and plans in general. This is based on the best possible evidence that can be garnered at present. And when you talk about immigration or migration, obviously immigration will come down in the country with Brexit, I presume. But I'm almost certain that inward migration into Leicestershire will continue to rise, because it will be a nice place to live. There will be good homes in the right places if we get this right, and the right jobs there. The city is redeveloping, so people can live if they want to in the county and go to a nice city. So these sort of things will, I think, make people want to live in the city or the county and make the numbers wrong. And also, when you talk about population characteristics, it's a pretty broad brush, but people will live longer. And, of course, they will want to live in smaller households. So I honestly think the numbers will definitely be wrong. They will probably be more. But they are, at the moment, and I think the professionals down that end will tell you, they are based on the best possible evidence that can be garnered at present.
Okay.
I accept entirely what Nick has said. I'm a bit concerned about how the numbers then are swapped and changed at local authority level.
I can perhaps just come. Should I perhaps come in first, and then perhaps Grant will add? I mean, I think the first thing to say is that this strategic growth plan, once agreed, won't sit on the shelf, setting the framework for local plans until 2050. Clearly, as new evidence comes forward in the future, there will come a time in a few years' time when we'll want to review this and update it so that we've got an up-to-date strategic growth plan that takes account of new evidence. But I think the other thing to say as well is that local plan inquiries, as an expression of our of how we've cooperated to come to a housing distribution across the wider area, this will be an important consideration for a local plan inspector. But our local plan inspector will also need to look at the up-to-date evidence brought to his attention as well at the local plan inquiry. Yeah. So, I think taking those things in the round means that there will be that degree of flexibility. But I think, given the duty to cooperate and given the robustness of this piece of work, or certainly we think it's robust, this will be an important consideration at those inquiries.
The only thing I would add is that the government are talking about something called the Statement of Common Ground, which each local planning authority will be required to agree in respect of each local plan. That's all the things we can agree on. I think the strategic growth plan will perform the bulk of that, but that Statement of Common Ground there'll be an opportunity to revise and refresh that in each local plan. So if the city can deliver more numbers, effectively, for example, we would be saying in our conversation with all partners that luckily we can deal with these more numbers, and that's something that we'd have to approach at each local plan examination, and again within the context of reviews of the plan as well.
Okay, thank you. I've got Rosita now.
Yes, and I hear what you're saying, but for any avoidance of doubt, could you just go to page 58 in relation to the CPRE statement, because I know I will be questions about this at the end of the day. Could you tell me, they put a table there, why those numbers differ so much from yours? Could you give me an answer that we can reflect to the general public? Thank you.
Yeah. Who's going to comment on the difference on these figures?
What I suggest is that actually that table will need to be amended when the government's new national formula is clearly spelt out. So again, because the whole point of the government coming up with a new formula, a new approach, is to try and avoid this sort of debate about different interpretations of numbers. So I would suggest that, again, the government have given us an indication of what the formula is going to be. They've said they're going to produce the new MPPF before Easter. That will give you a categoric national formula, and that'll be so there won't be any need to debate that table. And again, I will wait and see what that formula states.
So can you come back on that, please, Grant? So we're then talking, or we are saying that the figures within the growth plan could alter after that.
I think, as I said before, the latest indication from what the government said in the formula, our numbers would stay almost exactly the same.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's quite helpful to clarify that. So we'll remove all this discussion about the numbers. Right, okay. Can we then move on to the third section then, which is a number of subheadings about the strategy and the distribution. Now, we've talked a lot about the A46 growth corridor. Taking the next bullet point down, again, to Grant, there's been some discussion recently with the government about saying, look, in city centres, let's go up. What's the scope for going up and therefore increasing density, isn't it?
The numbers in my presentation allow for quite a substantial amount of development in the city centre. That's already in the plan. What we're doing at the moment is doing some capacity assessment work and looking at how much further we may be able to go. And again, that's detailed work that's ongoing. The one thing I would caution, though, is that Historic England have already expressed concerns about recent substantial tall building applications in the city. They consider Leicester to be fortunate in that it is relatively untroubled by tall buildings when you compare it to other cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool and others. So Historic England have put us on notice that they're watching how we deal with our applications for tall buildings, but we will be bringing forward evidence in our local plan to show that we've actually looked to absolutely deliver as much development as we can on brownfield land in terms of the city centre and the regeneration and the rest of the city. It's in the interest of the city for us to do that.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the balance between, I know the southern gateway is linked with the road, but then you've got the northern gateway and you've got figures. So you've got 10,000 for the northern gateway and 40,000 dwellings for the southern gateway. Nick, a few months ago you said that was 60,000 in the press, but I assume that's now settled, that it is coming down to 40. But what I'm coming at is you've spoken an awful lot about what's happening with HS2 up there, about the growth strategy and support, the rail link to the airport. We've heard a lot about employment sites up there, Toton and so on. Have we got the balance, the distribution right? Why are we going for 40 in the south and only 10 in the north? Is there not a fairer distribution there that recognises the rail link, the rail improvements are all going to be HS2? You've already admitted that we're very unlikely to be able to bring off a link to Colville and Burton. So why are we not looking to link this more to what we know is coming with HS2 and rail?
it's not just the HS2, Simon. I mean, the northern, in my view, that is quite a few houses, but it is pretty constricted up there, and it's pretty hard to get to at present if you live there. You're going to have 30 to 40,000 jobs coming in the next 4 to 5 years, with Wroxhill opening, plus another massive application coming in for another huge airport hub for UPS. You've got all the stuff that's going on up around the Sawley Crossroads and up there, massive amounts of development. You've got M&S distribution up there. And to be fair, Simon, as well, there is no unemployment. It's a bit like Lutterworth. We will hopefully have to get people in from the city, which still has pockets of unemployment, or they'll have to come down from Long Eaton or somewhere where there is unemployment. But it will be hard to get there. But I can't answer why North West have come up or the MAG have come up with that number. But in my view, I'd have thought it should be larger, but it would be difficult to access and possibly exceedingly unpopular. But I'll just have to let the professionals who went to the MAG answer the question.
40,000 in the southern. Along that road is going to be unpopular as well. It's the balance.
I can only revert to the professionals who are on the MAG who can say, well, I know North West came up with that number.
Well, the number of 10,000 is actually spread between Charnwood and North West Leicestershire. And one of the factors we took into account is that there is a huge amount of growth already in the pipeline in that area. Not all of it has actually been delivered yet. And that's particularly the case with the housing development. There are several sustainable urban extensions in Charnwood and in North West Leicestershire which have been given planning permission but are proving to be very, very slow to come forward. That's the first thing. The second thing is that physically that area of land is actually quite constrained in terms of the roads and rail connections that crisscross through it, so it's difficult to actually find sites that are not constrained also by flooding, for example, and also environmental constraints. Remember, the environmental assets plan that we've produced shows that there are several environmental constraints that kick into that area. And I think the final point is that the boundary of Leicestershire kicks in very, very close to those areas of economic opportunity, so we actually become limited in terms of land that's within Leicestershire. There's a huge amount of activity that's taking place in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. They're proposing major hubs around Totton, innovation centres, technology centres. They've got a series of garden villages dotted around the southern part of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. But that general situation contrasts with the southern edge of the county, where you talk about there's a figure of 40,000 dwellings coming forward around the south and east side of Leicester. But that's actually a part of the county where there's the longest stretch of brand new road proposed. Coming back to the A46, there's a very long stretch of new road coming through that area. So physically there is more land in that area as well.
There's your answer, Simon.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got Terry Einan next, and then David Bill.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to concentrate on the areas of managed growth, and particularly what Pat was saying about the Northern Gateway, because on the consultation document that a lot of people will be getting, we're being told that and I know this to be true, that much is to be built in some of these areas, and you've mentioned that, and is dependent upon new local infrastructure. And it also points out that the lack of essential infrastructure is also slowing the pace of delivery in those areas. And that comes back, I think, to my original kind of definition, that these actually fail. Currently what's going on fails the test, in that we're building houses, 4-bedroom houses, that people, perhaps in Ellistown, can't afford to live in, and they can't actually get from those houses near Ellistown to the massive growth in employment up at the Northern Gateway. It takes an hour by the Skylink bus to get up to the airport, and we're going to be in a position, if we're not careful as Leicestershire, of providing an excellent Northern Gateway employment area for everyone in Nottingham and Derby. And I am concerned that we're still this doesn't presumably kick into 2031, but will have a legacy by then of not managed growth certainly in this kind of northwest area, but for places like Colville, managed decline, and excellent growth in the northern parishes, many of whom are like Mr. Terry Richardson was saying, he says nobody likes houses. If you watch that lovely programme on television about South Oxfordshire's development, and it's pretty clear from the survey that they did there. Some people do want houses, very much, and it tends to be the poor, the inarticulate who would like somewhere to live, and who do want to have affordable homes. So I think I do in general support this strategy, but I am seriously concerned that by the time this actually kicks in, we will have such a legacy of mismatched planning in certain areas that we will have so much to catch up on.
I'm not sure there's an answer to that. Okay.
Just one point that might be worth bearing in mind is having this plan protects you from claims from, say, Nottingham, Derby, Birmingham, Coventry, for making arguments that we ought to be taking some of their growth that they're actually struggling to meet. Because, and as I say, I was in a meeting with planners in Derby and Nottingham the other week, and they would love to have a plan like this because they understand if we show that we can meet, we're planning to meet our needs reasonably, but we can't take any more growth from unmet needs and pressures elsewhere. And I can guarantee that places like Birmingham and Coventry are really struggling to meet their allocations. So there's a bit of a danger in terms of, particularly where there are significant developments adjacent to the county's boundary, of almost opening up a conversation where what you said, you're almost meeting Nottingham and Derby's needs. We absolutely need to be careful to make it clear that this is about meeting our needs. So that just might be a point that's worth reflecting on.
Yep.
I think we might end up meeting their needs for employment, but I've got 4,500 houses in Colville which currently aren't being built, and as you're saying, Birmingham would like to have some houses. I'd like to have a railway line, the Birmingham to Baggoth line via Colville. If they would pay for it, we would be happy, I'm sure, to have a few more Brummies in Colville if they would pay for our National Forest line.
Birmingham to Baggoth.
I can say one thing. One thing I can agree with Terry on is what she said, is that up in the Northern Gateway it will need smaller, cheaper housing to accommodate people. It cannot just be full of, and they won't be 250,000 up there, there'll be 500,000. But that's the local plan, I would imagine, will deal with that mix. And the other point she does make, which is valid, it is incredibly difficult to get from Colville up to where the jobs growth is. The same goes for trying to get some of the city people there. You know, there are pockets of unemployment in the city, there are pockets of unemployment in Colville, but to get the people from those locations to these jobs, even if they're sufficiently well qualified, you know, and there's a skills problem, is incredibly difficult. And it's a point well worth making and minuting and me commenting on.
Right, okay. I've got David Bill, then Michael Charlesworth.
Thank you. Just ask for your assistance before I move on, and that is the submissions that have been made to us by CPRE, Leicester Shelter Housing and Public Health all contain points which I think are of relevance. The quality of the air, the need for affordable housing, and the need to protect the environment. Could I ask, how are these ideas to be addressed or incorporated? Because I hope that they will be passed on to the Cabinet and be part of the final document.
They will be part of our report. So the Scrutiny Commission will be a report to the Cabinet in the normal way that we do, and they will be appended to that Cabinet report. Can I just state, just for the record, that Mr. Rhodes has had to leave the meeting. He's got another appointment. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's the first question. Now, coming on to this section here, I've noticed that we haven't included anything to do with the engagement with other agencies. They are mentioned in passing in the covering report, at least some of them are, but each of them, we do need to know, for example, what the dialogue has been with Highways England. and so on and so forth. But before we come to that, can I just talk about the so-called A46 growth corridor and the Southern Gateway, because they're both linked. And you, Chairman, have raised the fact that there seems to now to be 40,000 people or houses linked to the Southern Gateway. Earlier on, as I drew attention to, we had a plan up there of various road schemes, such as the A46 expressway, which is now going to be called the A46 Foss Way, and there was a plan. Now, I've not seen that plan before, and I really would like to see that in detail, because I can't see how we can sit here and approve something not knowing what we're not with a thing that just disappears.
My understanding is that there is no route, and in the end it won't be our decision where the route is. That will be consulted, but it will be a DFT decision on what the route is. Is that right?
You're absolutely correct. At this point in time, there is no definitive route. There is an awful lot of work to be gone through before there would be a definitive route, and that would involve Highways England as well as a number of other agencies. Equally, as ever, when we go through a scheme as it gets closer to delivery, there are multiple opportunities for consultation and engagement in terms of the detail of that route. However, we're a very long way off that at this point in time. There is no definitive route. Those plans up there, of which one of them is in the Perspective for Growth, actually that shows a conceptual line around the south and east of Leicester. The other plans actually just show wider out the existing A46 route as on the ground, online route across the country from Bristol, Exeter, up this way and then on to Newark. That is as on any road map that you would find.
I would still like to study it.
A public inquiry for that road? Would there be to build a trunk road, would there be a public inquiry?
Chances are a road of that scale, in terms of going through the detail and the processes, yes, there would be an extensive, public engagement, public inquiry process.
I would like to know more about this, because the old A46 used to go through Smockington Hollow. Well, it's strategic if you live in Sharnford, because it's damn close. Now, if we're talking about a Fossway route, that's a bit further along. And I know where that goes. That's a lovely road from Narborough all the way down through Warwickshire. But I would still like to have some idea,
We can circulate that.
What those roads, where this road is
we
going
can
to
circulate that, but in terms of the possible route, there is no route for it.
It'll be in the middle. Okay. It's going to be through the sky somewhere. Yeah.
Well, at this stage.
The point is that we are now referring to a Southern Gateway, and this afternoon we're being asked to approve the concept, presumably, of the Southern Gateway. Not it'll be our decision, it'll be... Oh, we're not.
We're not being asked to approve in the sense of give our support. We are collecting evidence and clarification, and then we will send our comments based on this afternoon's discussion to the Cabinet. The Cabinet will then decide whether to support this plan as it is, ask for some changes, amendments to it, or whatever.
The Gateway, in its original iteration of this plan, was based in Hinckley. Hinckley was going to be the Southern Gateway, and it was going to have many thousands of houses, which we welcomed, as Nick would know. And then, for some reason or other, that Southern Gateway blob on the map started to roll down the A5. And I think it now rests somewhere like Wibtoft or Willey, or somewhere like one of the W's along the A5. But it's still called the Southern Gateway, and it's got a sort of dotted line round it, and and that's it. But what do we mean by gateway? A gateway to what? The only two roads out of Willey, for example, are the going northwest along the A5 or south east along the way the A5, or it could be Wibtoft, which has a similar, apart from a few semi-cart tracks going off in various directions. What I'm asking for is exactly what is being proposed here. If there's going to be a new road coming in there, what is this new road? Is it in addition to the to Nix Foss Way Express motorway, whatever it's called, or is this something different altogether? You see, if we're being asked to just to tick box this and pass it on, I would very much like to know what it is we are meant to be recommending for public consultation. What is the Southern Gateway a gateway to?
Can we have a definition of what a Southern Gateway is, please?
Should have that, but obviously aspirationally, I'd like to see something done radical with the A5. You know, it's an appallingly bad road at the moment. It really wants like dualling right the way through from the M1 right through to the A42, but that would be another aspiration to facilitate growth for you, David. As long as it doesn't go through Seckington Hollow or whatever, and Smockington Hollow.
One of the most dangerous junctions in the county. A lot of people have lost their lives there, so don't take it too flippantly. The A5, we all agree, should be dualled all the way through, and I have been pressing for as long as I've been a member for that to happen, but every time I'm told it's a low priority, it's never going to happen. You can get a little bit of dual, but then we're going to put that off because of whatever it might be. It never happens. The queues on the A5 are dreadful, and they start about this time of the day and they carry on. But there seems to be no
okay, David,
interest
I think
to actually do anything.
We're getting
with
off strategic
yes.
issues.
No.
But thank you for that. Right, Michael Charlesworth.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and be brief. Clearly, there's very little detail around the SGP that we can pin down today. And a vision's not a bad thing. There's no problem with visions, but that vision has got to take in the residents as well. And political leadership's one thing, political suicide's another. We don't know the detail around the A46 growth corridor or the road, the expressway, but the potential is there that it will be very close to Oadby and Wigston, and that will be the borough probably most affected by this. So, two questions. Can I have an assurance that if councils later this year approve the SGP, that the A46 growth corridor, well, probably not the corridor, but the expressway will come back to the public and elected members before it goes ahead? And the second question is, after the consultation finishes in April, when are districts and boroughs and the council expected to approve the SGP?
So, two questions about process there. I mean, in a way, I think Anne's partly answered, because she said that on a road of that scale, we would expect a full-blown public inquiry, but
expect is not enough.
Okay. What's the rules around having a public inquiry?
Well, can I just clarify, actually, before you get to anywhere near that stage, there will be levels of consultation in terms of, here's what, just actually think about, maybe you're not aware about, but the Melton Distributor Road. We've done a whole host of consultation at different levels, from here's a higher level of thinking at the moment, here's the options east and west, etc., then pinning it down on one side, and actually then detailed options when you get to that side, literally, 5 metres this way, 10 metres that way, etc. So there's a whole host of iterations from the high level down to the detail before you then even get to the statutory processes in terms of public inquiries, etc. So we'd absolutely say there will be ample opportunity for public to feed in, both at the high level as it goes through. More detailed work comes up so they can understand better where it can go, where it can feasibly fit, what are the constraints, etc. There's lots of opportunity and iterations of that.
Adoption and approval after the consultation.
Shall I just respond on that point? The consultation ends on the 5th of April, and thereafter we'll take a report on all of the consultation responses received to the Members' Advisory Group. At the same time, or just after, at the same time we'll be going through a process of considering what changes, if any, should be made to the plan, and we'll ask MAG to consider those changes probably in summer or early autumn. And assuming that MAG is content with the revised version of the plan, we would hope to take it through the governance of individual authorities towards the end of this year, October, November, December time.
Okay, that's very clear. Rosita.
Thank you. First of all, 2 points of information. I was at an A5 meeting, Councillor Charlesworth, and they're putting together a briefing for 4 routes for that. And Councillor Bill, I understand Alberto Costa and the Hinckley MPs are either meeting today at the Houses of Commons to debate a dualling of the A5. So I only got an email last night and I only just skimmed over it. But must have also a very local point for myself, if you indulge me, please. Now, I'm very much aware that this is a strategic document, and I'm very happy with it being strategic, and I'm not against development of any kind or sort. But if I go back to Anne's comment, we are talking about quality of life, reliable journeys, and transport to enable growth. Now, whilst everywhere else we have got a harbour transport study, a mountain distributor route, etc., etc., and everybody has got something, yet we have identified Lutterworth as a key centre. And if we are talking transport to enable growth, why isn't there anything down there to do just that with Lutterworth? Because it's very difficult to sell any future growth without having at least a strategic, and I know that strategic doesn't mean an implementation of anything, but why haven't we got a strategic proposal for Lutterworth? And I know you will say no pain without gain, but there are other concepts in here where there hasn't been any pain and, you know, there is gain. So could you please talk me through that for the record, please? Thank you.
Anne.
Just to say, you'll be well aware that there's, development sites being looked at there, and the infrastructure to support those is under consideration. I think what we would say in terms of the wider picture for Lutterworth, the very work that we're undertaking now in terms of that modelling work, we're expecting that to then identify where there are pressures on the network and therefore where we need more detail about interventions that might be needed for that. So I would very much hope that that's coming forward as this next iteration of work that's happening and undergoing at the moment. As you say, what we've done is we've identified the really big ticket strategic stuff, the stuff that's coming out of Midlands Connect, the stuff we're aware of already through local plans. Beyond that, it's this next stage of work that we would expect to identify where we do need further infrastructure to support the growth.
If I may come back, now we're talking about a possible event of a Junction 20A, which, it is quite integral to the proposed growth area, as it states here. Now, Junction 20A, it's in David's district, but it's only a credit card difference between the Harbour district and all the infrastructure. The traffic will then, most likely, quite a lot go onto the A426 to meet the Golden Triangle and the motorway. There will be lots of rat racing, but there hasn't been any mention of any further studies. So whilst I hear you, I wonder whether that can be reflected in some of the future documents to reassure the general public around there that if they're accepting development and the impact of development from Blaby, that their plight or the impact will be recognised and will be evaluated strategically.
I would just say that work is very designed to, the very point of it is designed to reassure that actually we've got a plan, we know what's needed in order to support this level of growth. I would come back, however, to my earlier point in terms of the work will actually evolve over time. The big ticket items we'll be able to identify, etc., the areas of pressure where we have to then do further work, etc., right down to individual sites much further down the line that have come through the local plans, etc., and we're looking at the real mix and the exact package for that development that will make that work. However, that work is going on, will happen over time. As I say, we're doing modelling work at the moment that's coming out, looking at exactly if we put 20A in, if we put the E46 in, etc., exactly what does that mean in terms of the network with this level of growth, where do we need to do further work, and what needs to happen to make that go ahead. So yes, what I'd say is the work's happening that we'll be able to give those reassurances as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. And finally, I've got Brenda Seat.
Thank you, Chair. I hesitated really joining in with this because I didn't want to get accused of providing just a statement instead of scrutiny. But I think we're getting very hung up over the expressway gateway. It's just a road that's connecting growth points. Going to the shelter comments in there, and the comment there was, as clearly significant housing is in need of the county towns, so that the plan's growth points in those towns make sense. So the A46 corridor joins up those growth points, and strategically that is sensible, and we're getting far too hung up on the nitty-gritty of where that road will go. We know, because we in Charnwood, and I'm sure other areas as well, with the developments that we've had, we've gone through the strategic planning, and now I'm in talks with the nitty-gritty parts of the development within Thurmaston, which is not an insignificant development of 4,500 houses. And for that, we're taking a lot of the houses from the city's development here in that. So it's that at that level you get down to that nitty-gritty, the development, well, we don't want the road there, move it a little bit to the 100 metres this way or that way. I fully support this. If we don't have this plan, then the small developments will blight this county, and I just think a vision for the future and a strategic vision needs to be made, and it needs to be made now.
I think you've probably made a closing sort of statement there, although I will ask the panel if whether they want to make any closing statements. No, Nick? Pat?
It's been well worth attending, Simon. All your comments will be considered by the Cabinet and be attached to the agenda. Tom will also be updating us. So thank you very much. You've given it a good airing. So well done.
Yeah, well, I think we've nobody can argue that we haven't delved into it in considerable, perhaps too much detail for some members, but nevertheless, members want to understand what the impact is in their area. So can I thank everyone that's coming? There will be detailed, Rosemary, I don't know how many pages of notes she's done, but they will be written up, they will be circulated, and members will have access, and the slides will be circulated. Can I thank everyone for coming and close the meeting? Yes, David, very briefly.
Conclusion you're going to come to in your report to the Cabinet? Because
we don't know yet. So it will be a summary, a factual summary of all the points raised. If we want to then do something beyond that, based on this, we'll have to have a separate discussion.